Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo, a quiet corner of the internet for tired minds, still curious about deep time. Whether you're getting ready to sleep or just calming your mind while driving, cooking, working, or even showering, this is your invitation to slow down, to step away from the noise, and drift into a story older than history, older than memory. If this kind of content helps you to rest, to focus, or to satisfy that late-night curiosity, consider tapping like, subscribing, and sharing. It's the simplest way to support long-form, thoughtful, fact-based storytelling for curious sapiens like you. And tell me, how do you use this? Are you falling asleep, driving, or working with headphones on? Or maybe, let me know where in the world you're watching from. I always read the comment. Oh, and if you happen to drift off midway, I've added timestamps in the description. So tomorrow you can pick up exactly where you left the story, because this whole journey is absolutely worth it. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. All right, let's begin. If we want to understand the man who would one day lie frozen in a mountain pass for over 5,000 years, we cannot begin with him. Not yet. We have to step back. Not just a few centuries, not even a few millennia. We need to return to a quieter, stranger time. A time when Europe was not yet the Europe we know. A time before cities, before metal, before borders. A time when the cold bones of the last ice age still echoed in the forests, and the first threads of farming were just beginning to stitch a new kind of world together. Roughly 9,000 years ago, give or take a few generations, a revolution began. But it was not the kind of revolution we often imagine. There were no banners, no armies, no speeches, just seeds. Seeds and sheep and quiet decisions made by quiet hands. The Neolithic Revolution, the slow generational shift from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. It did not begin in Europe. It began further east, in the Fertile Crescent, in what is now parts of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. Around 10,000 BCE, small communities there began cultivating wheat, barley, peas, and lentils. They domesticated sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. And over thousands of years, this knowledge spread, not instantly, not evenly, but slowly, like water seeping through stone. By around 7000 BCE, the first waves of farmers began crossing into Europe. They moved in two broad directions. One group followed the Mediterranean coastline, hopping from island to island and hugging the shores of what is now Greece, Italy, France, and Spain. The other pushed inland through the Balkans, following the great river valleys, eventually reaching the Danube, the heartline of continental Europe. And here is where the story begins to get complicated. For Europe was not empty. It was home to hunter-gatherers, people whose ancestors had survived the Ice Age, people who knew the forests, the rivers, the mountains, people who had watched mammoths disappear and reindeer vanish northward as the glaciers melted. And when these new farmers arrived, with their crops, their livestock, their ceramic pots, and their unfamiliar ways, they did not simply replace the old world. They collided with it. For a long time, archaeologists debated what happened next. Was it a violent conquest, a peaceful sharing of knowledge, a slow process of intermarriage and adaptation? The answer, as it often is in prehistory, appears to be yes, all of the above. In some places, the local hunter-gatherers resisted the new ways for centuries. In others, they adopted farming quickly, blending it with their own traditions. And in many places, the farmers and foragers became one people, genetically, culturally, and technologically fused. Genetics has given us a clearer picture in recent years. Thanks to the ancient DNA retrieved from burials, bones, and teeth, we now know that the early farmers of Europe carried ancestry largely descended from Anatolian population, the very people whose ancestors had first domesticated plants and animals in the Near East. These farmers brought with them not only wheat, barley, and livestock, but also new technologies, pottery, weaving, polished stone tools, and perhaps most importantly, a completely different way of seeing the land. The shift from foraging to farming was not just economic, it was psychological. A hunter-gatherer lives with the landscape, moving as the seasons change, following the migrations of animals, harvesting wild plants. A farmer reshapes the landscape, clears forests, builds permanent homes, fences in animals, plants fields, waits. The rhythm of life changed, from the mobility of the wild to the stability of the farm. But the story is not one of uniform progress. Farming was never an easy bargain. It brought more food, yes, but it also brought new risks: crop failure, famine, disease. Larger communities meant more conflict, more hierarchy, more dependence on systems that, when they broke, could lead to catastrophe. And yet, over time, the farming way of life became the dominant one. By around 5,500 BCE, Neolithic farming communities stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Atlantic coast, across the Alpine valleys, along the Danube, into Britain, into Scandinavia. Each region developed its own styles, of pottery, of houses, of ritual. Some groups built vast megalithic tombs, like the passage graves of Western Europe. Others carved figurines, worshipped fertility deities, or developed complex systems of exchange and trade. And yet, even as these Neolithic worlds flourished, something else was stirring, something that would eventually reshape not just Europe, but the entire human story: metal. The earliest experiments with metal were not about weapons or tools, they were about color. Around 7000 BCE in Anatolia, people began collecting green and blue copper ores, malachite and azurite, not to make blades but beads, ornaments, beautiful things. But somewhere along the way, someone noticed that when these stones were placed in a fire, perhaps accidentally, the color changed. The stone melted, it became liquid. And when that liquid cooled, it hardened into something new: copper, the first metal. It is hard to overstate what a strange and almost magical discovery this was. For nearly 3 million years, humans had shaped their world with stone, bone, and wood. Now, for the first time, there was a material that could be melted, poured, cast, reshaped. It was soft, yes, far too soft for most tools, but it opened a door. That door led to the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, a strange in-between world, not quite Neolithic, not yet the Bronze Age, a time when stone tools and metal objects coexisted, when farmers still relied on flint knives and polished stone axes, but also carried small copper awls, fish hooks, or, in rare cases, the coveted copper axe. By around 4500 BCE, copper working had spread north from Anatolia into the Balkans. Evidence of the earliest mining and smelting appears in the mountains of Serbia and Bulgaria. Great settlements like Varna on the shores of the Black Sea rose to prominence, its cemetery famously filled with gold and copper grave goods, including the oldest known worked gold in the world. These were among the first societies to show clear evidence of wealth inequality. Some people were buried with elaborate treasures, others with nothing. This was a world Ötzi was born into, a world in transition. The old rhythms of the Neolithic still held: small-scale farming, herding, seasonal migration between lowland fields and high mountain pastures. But the threads of a new order were beginning to weave through the fabric of life. Copper, trade networks that stretched hundreds of kilometers, new ideas about status, wealth, ownership. Ötzi's ancestors, like many in the Alpine regions, were likely descendants of both the Anatolian farming migrants and the older Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Europe. DNA tells us that the people of the Alps carried mostly Neolithic farmer ancestry, but with a meaningful minority of hunter-gatherer genes woven in, an echo of older times. This fusion was not just genetic, it shaped their tools, their diets, their beliefs. By the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, the landscape Ötzi called home was dotted with small farming villages. These were not cities, there were no kings, no armies. But these communities were organized. They practiced transhumance, moving livestock seasonally between lowland valleys in the winter and high alpine pastures in the summer. This was a demanding way of life. It required intimate knowledge of the mountains, of the weather, of where the wild game was, of when the snows would come. And yet this world was not isolated. The copper in Ötzi's famous axe, as we now know, came not from the Alps but from Tuscany, far to the south. This tells us something astonishing. Even 5,300 years ago, long before written language reached Europe, there were trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. People moved, ideas moved, goods moved. But this was also a world of danger. The archaeological record hints at growing violence in some regions. Fortified settlements appear in parts of Central Europe. Mass graves suggest episodes of warfare or raids. Whether this violence was endemic or occasional, we cannot fully say. But life in the Copper Age required caution, strength, and perhaps, sometimes, weapons close at hand. All of this, every thread of it, feeds into the mystery of Ötzi. Because he was not a relic of a dying world. He was the product of a vibrant, changing one. A world where the Stone Age still clung to the edges of life, even as metal flickered into view. A world where farming, hunting, herding, crafting, and traveling were all part of the same tangled existence. And it is here, on this long slope of history, that our story truly begins. A man steps into the mountains, carrying the tools of his time, wearing the clothes of his culture, shaped by a world 3,000 years deep. The mountains are waiting, the snow will come, and soon, a murder will freeze in time. Next, we follow the footprints into the high passes, and we meet the man who would become the Iceman. The strange thing about revolutions is how slowly they tend to unfold. From a distance of 5,000 years, the arrival of metal in prehistoric Europe might look like a sharp turning point. But standing inside that history, among the forests, the herds, the valleys of the alpine world, it would not have felt sudden. It would have felt like life, mostly as it always had been, but with new and unfamiliar materials slowly finding their way into old hands. By around 4,500 BCE, copper had quietly entered the toolkits of some European communities, not as a replacement for stone, but as an addition. The Stone Age, in a very literal sense, was not yet over. Almost every practical task, hunting, farming, woodworking, leather making, was still accomplished with flint, obsidian, bone, and antler. A copper blade was not sharper than flint. It was softer, blunter, more prone to dulling. And yet, despite these limitations, it was a revelation. Because copper could do something no stone ever could. It could melt. It could flow like water when heated. It could be shaped, poured, reforged, and repaired. It was, in the most literal sense, a kind of alchemy, a bridge between the natural world and the human imagination. It is easy to forget how astonishing this must have seemed to the people of the Chalcolithic. For nearly 3 million years, the human relationship with the material world was one of subtraction. You struck a stone to remove flakes. You carved wood by cutting away. You broke bones to expose the marrow. But metal was different. Metal was about addition, about transformation, about changing something from one state to another entirely. And yet, it was not an immediate transformation, not even close. Most tools remained stone, most weapons remained stone. The labor of daily life was still carried on the shoulders of flint blades and polished stone axes. Copper, when it appeared, was precious, rare, and often symbolic as much as functional. We can see this most clearly in the archaeological record of graves. Across much of Europe in the 4th millennium BCE, high-status burials begin to include copper objects. Daggers, axes, awls, small beads or spiral ornaments. These were not disposable items. They were heirlooms, markers of identity, of status, of perhaps something even stranger, an association with forces that were seen as magical. After all, to take a rock from the earth, crush it, set it in fire, and coax metal from its core, this was not just technology, it was sorcery of the highest order. The earliest true evidence of copper mining and smelting in Europe appears in the Balkans, around modern-day Serbia and Bulgaria, sometime after 5500 BCE. By the time we approach the centuries around Ötzi's life, roughly 3400 to 3300 BCE, copper working had reached far beyond the Balkans, into Central Europe, across the Alps, into Italy, into Spain, into Britain. A network of knowledge, of trade, of craft was already well in motion. But here is where we need to slow down, because copper, remarkable though it was, did not immediately revolutionize daily life. The reason is simple. Copper, in its pure form, is soft. Too soft for most practical tools that endure heavy strain. A copper axe could fell a small tree, but it would deform quickly. The cutting edge would warp. The material itself was malleable, but that very property made it fragile under stress. And yet Ötzi carried one, a beautifully crafted copper axe with a long yew wood haft, secured with birch tar resin and leather bindings. An object that was both practical and deeply symbolic. In fact, it remains the oldest fully intact copper axe ever found in Europe. And it raises an obvious question. If stone was still better for most cutting tasks, why carry a copper axe at all? Part of the answer is surely status. A copper axe was an expensive item. The copper in Ötzi's axe was sourced not from the Alps but from Tuscany, hundreds of kilometers away. This was not a backyard workshop job. It was the result of long-distance trade, specialized knowledge, and a labor-intensive process of mining, smelting, casting, and crafting. But there is another layer to this, a cultural one. Across many ancient societies, early metal objects seem to have occupied a strange space between the practical and the sacred. A copper blade was not simply a tool, it was a marker, a badge of prestige, a signal that the owner was someone of means, of connections, of standing, perhaps even someone viewed with a degree of awe or suspicion. After all, the people who controlled fire and stone had always been respected, but those who could transform rock into metal, those were something else entirely. And yet, for all its novelty, copper lived side by side with stone for many centuries. Flint arrowheads, polished stone adzes, obsidian blades. These were still the backbone of daily life. The alpine world in which Ötzi lived was not one of sudden technological leaps, but of gradual layering, new materials, new techniques, but anchored deeply in old ways. The world of the Alps in 3300 BCE was a mosaic of small, kin-based communities, villages tucked into river valleys, seasonal camps in the high meadows, networks of transhumance, the careful seasonal movement of people and animals between summer and winter pastures. Life here required a precise and intimate understanding of the land, the rhythms of the snow, the pathways of game, the cycles of plant growth. These were societies that blended farming, herding, hunting, and gathering into a fluid, adaptive way of life. They raised sheep and goats, cultivated wheat and barley, but they also hunted ibex, red deer, and chamois in the mountains. They gathered herbs, mushrooms, and medicinal plants. The boundaries between domesticated and wild were porous, and it was not an isolated world. Far from it. The artifacts found with Ötzi tell us that alpine communities were deeply enmeshed in regional trade networks. His flint tools came from the Trento region, nearly 100 kilometers south of where he died. His copper axe, as we know, came from Tuscany. The bow he carried, unfinished, was carved from yew, an alpine hardwood prized for its strength and elasticity, still used for English longbows thousands of years later. Even the smallest details speak of a world more connected than we might expect. The string for his backpack was made from bast fiber, likely from lime trees. His shoes were engineered masterpieces of survival, combining bear hide, deer leather, and woven grass insulation. His leggings were stitched from goat hide, his hat made of bear fur. Every material carefully chosen for its properties: warmth, water resistance, durability. The world Ötzi moved through was also a landscape shaped by deep time. The Alps had been a formidable barrier for thousands of years, but by Ötzi's time, people had learned to navigate them seasonally. The passes were dangerous, but they were also highways, paths not just for individuals, but for ideas, for goods, for knowledge. And here, in the context of copper and stone, we must speak about risk, because metal, for all its symbolic power, did not come without danger. The very act of mining was hazardous. Collapsing shafts, toxic fumes from smelting, the release of arsenic and lead into the air and soil. Some of the earliest evidence for occupational poisoning in human history comes from Chalcolithic mining communities, and those who worked copper were often viewed with a curious blend of respect and fear. They were specialists, keepers of secret knowledge about fire, ore, and transformation. Was Ötzi one of these specialists? The evidence is uncertain. Traces of arsenic and copper have been found in his hair, possibly suggesting involvement in metalworking, or perhaps simply exposure through trade or proximity. We cannot say for sure. The geological chemistry of the Alps itself can contaminate the tissues of anyone buried there for 5,000 years. Science, for all its power, still lives with uncertainty. What we do know is this. By 3300 BCE, the Alpine world had fully absorbed the knowledge of copper working into its broader Neolithic framework. It had not replaced stone, It had not erased the old ways, but it had added something potent, something transformative. And in this world of stone and copper, of trade and mountains, a man set out on what would become the last journey of his life, carrying a copper axe, an unfinished bow, 14 arrows, and the accumulated knowledge of countless generations who had lived and died in these valleys before him. He could not have known, of course, that his death would become a kind of message in a bottle, a time capsule, a murder frozen into history, waiting patiently beneath the snow and the ice. If you strip away the myth of the frozen corpse, the celebrity of the mummy, and the forensic spectacle of his murder, you are left with something far more profound. A man, an ordinary sapiens, flesh and breath, a father perhaps, a neighbor, a companion to others who, like him, woke each day in a world that was still half wild and half tamed, a landscape balancing precariously between the old ways of hunting and the new reality of farming. And that is where this story now turns. Not to his death, not yet, but to his life. Who was the Iceman before he was the Iceman? What did he do when he rose each morning in the shadow of the Alps? What did his hands build? What did his back carry? What kind of sapiens was he, when his bones were still wrapped in skin and his story was still unfolding? The good news is that Ötzi is not a figure of myth or guesswork. Unlike the forgotten billions of his time whose lives evaporated without a trace, Ötzi has spoken to us. Through the isotopes in his teeth, the wear patterns on his joints, the pollen trapped in the seams of his clothes, and the microscopic scratches on his tools. Together, these fragments of data sketch out not just a man, but a way of life on the cusp of one of the most important technological shifts in human history. Let us begin with his body. His bones tell us that he was about 160 centimeters tall, a little over 5'3", and that he weighed perhaps between 50 to 60 kilograms, or roughly 110 to 130 pounds. Small by modern standards, but well within the norms for his era. More revealing than his size is the structure of his body itself. His tibias show profound strengthening along the medial-lateral axis, the kind of adaptation seen in individuals who spent a lifetime walking not on flat ground but over rugged, uneven terrain. His knees, hips, and lower spine are all deeply eroded by osteoarthritis, clear evidence of a life spent in constant movement. His upper body, by contrast, shows little of the stress markers we would expect in someone engaged in repetitive manual labor like grinding grain or hauling water. His shoulders, wrists, and elbows are relatively pristine. This asymmetry in wear patterns has led biomechanical experts to a strong consensus. Ötzi was a traveler, not a farmer chained to fields. But travel for what? Was he moving animals, hunting game, trading goods, or perhaps all of these at once? Here the isotopic data speaks. The chemical signatures embedded in the enamel of his teeth record the geology of his childhood, while those in his bones capture where he spent his adult life. The results are remarkably consistent. Ötzi was born, raised, and spent nearly his entire life within a relatively small radius on the southern flanks of the Ötztal Alps, in what is now northern Italy. Specifically, his isotopic fingerprints tie him to the valleys south of the main alpine ridge, particularly the Vinschgau Valley and the Isarco and Adige river systems. This is a man who knew every fold of this mountainous world, from the lowland pastures to the high alpine passes where his story would ultimately end. His tools add further texture to this portrait. His stone implements were not random collections of local debris. The flint in his dagger and arrowheads came from the Trento Plateau and Lake Garda region, about 100 kilometers south of where he lived. This tells us something subtle but important. Ötzi was not merely self-sufficient. He was connected to a broader network of exchange. Whether these materials were gathered by his own hand or through trade remains unknown, but their presence confirms that his community was not isolated. This is not the story of a hermit scraping out a lonely existence in a forgotten mountain hollow. It is the story of an integrated, mobile, and technologically sophisticated alpine culture. And then there is the famous copper axe, a marvel, not just of craftsmanship but of significance. The copper in Ötzi's axe has been traced to southern Tuscany, hundreds of kilometers from his home. Its presence rewrites the economic map of Chalcolithic Europe. This was not some provincial tool cobbled together from local scrap. This was a luxury item, a cutting-edge piece of metallurgical technology whose material journey crossed mountains, rivers, and tribal boundaries. Some archaeologists argue that such a tool marks Ötzi as a person of high status, perhaps not a king in any formal sense, but certainly someone whose role in his community afforded him access to the rarest and most valuable materials of his time. His clothing tells a similar story of resourcefulness fused with knowledge. His shoes were sophisticated multi-layered constructs, an inner net of woven grass stuffed with insulating dry grass, encased in soft bearskin uppers and durable deer hide soles. When experimentally recreated by modern footwear specialists and tested on alpine hikes, these shoes performed remarkably well, offering both insulation and traction superior to many modern hiking boots. His leggings were made of domesticated goat hide stitched into alternating light and dark strips, a choice that may have been functional, aesthetic, or both. His jacket combined sheepskin and goatskin panels, and his belt included a pouch with tools for fire-making, food processing, and tool repair. The famous woven grass cape he carried may have functioned as both a windbreaker and an emergency blanket or sleeping mat. What then was his profession? If we are honest, as every scientist must be, we cannot answer that question with absolute certainty. But the evidence converges toward a likely scenario. The biomechanical wear on his lower limbs fits perfectly with the life of a high-altitude pastoralist, someone who spent much of the year moving livestock between seasonal pastures in the valleys and the high alpine meadows. This would explain both his constant movement and his deep familiarity with the mountain environment. It also fits with the toolkit he carried: a bow for protection or hunting, a dagger for skinning or cutting, fire-starting equipment for survival in remote areas, and food storage for long journeys. Yet the presence of the copper axe and the diversity of his gear suggests that he was more than just a herder. He was likely a hunter as well. Ibex bones found in his stomach attest to his ability to secure wild game, and perhaps a trader too. The regional diversity of his tools, with materials sourced from locations spread across the southern Alps, points to participation in the growing networks of exchange that were beginning to crisscross Chalcolithic Europe. His diet completes the picture. The last meals in his stomach included a heavy portion of fatty ibex meat, supplemented with red deer organ meat and a side of einkorn wheat, probably in the form of bread. This is not the diet of a sedentary farmer, but of someone engaged in physically demanding labor, someone who needed high-calorie, high-fat sustenance to fuel long days in the mountains. Remarkably, the preserved food in his intestines still shows the striations of muscle fibers, proof that it was dried rather than cooked, an ancient version of portable jerky. There are further hints in his health. His body was riddled with joint pain, dental disease, and intestinal parasites. He suffered from arteriosclerosis, a hardening of the arteries that modern researchers were once shocked to find in someone who lived long before the advent of processed food. But genetics played a role here. Ötzi carried a predisposition for cardiovascular disease, reminding us yet again that even in prehistory, some burdens were not the fault of lifestyle but of biology. There is one last thread to pull: the tattoos. 61 in total. Simple parallel lines etched over joints that suffered from chronic pain: ankles, knees, lower back. Whether they were decorative, symbolic, or a form of proto-acupuncture remains debated, but they testify to a body deeply engaged with both the physical labor of mountain life and the human need to mitigate suffering. And so when we step back, we see not a caricature of a caveman, nor a primitive relic of a forgotten age. We see a sapiens who lived fully in his time, a man whose life was shaped by the rhythm of the seasons, the demands of survival, the opportunities of trade, and the ceaseless movement of feet over stone, grass, and snow. A man who carried with him the knowledge of his ancestors, the tools of his craft, and, unknowingly, the seeds of his own immortality. For when he died, the ice preserved him, and through him, the very fabric of his world. But of course, there is one thing we still do not know. If Ötzi lived in such an interconnected, functional, and resourceful society, what forces drove him, injured, armed, and burdened, up into that deadly alpine pass in the final days of his life? That is where we must go next. If there is one truth that holds steady across every grave, every skeleton, every fossilized trace of our species, it is this: the body remembers. Long after the voice has gone quiet, Long after the thoughts dissolve and the name vanishes, the body itself carries a story. It is a record of labor, of accidents, of genetics, of infection, of every injury that was ever survived and every hardship that left its mark. In this segment, we attempt to read the body of a man who never knew he was going to become the most studied human being from the entire Copper Age. A man whose bones, teeth, skin, and even parasites still whisper fragments of his story, 5,300 years later. Ötzi's bones first tell us something surprisingly simple. He was a small man. His living height was about 160 centimeters, or 5'3", a little below the average even for his time. His weight would have hovered near 50 kilograms, or about 110 pounds. Though, as always with mummies, that is an estimate filtered through the distortions of dehydration. His body, after 5 millennia trapped in ice, is desiccated, shrunken like a human raisin. Muscle, fat, and cartilage contracted and dried, throwing off attempts to reconstruct his exact living proportions. But size, of course, is not the story. Shape is, and shape tells us about a life. The first forensic revelation comes from his legs. The cortical thickness of his tibia, the main bone in the lower leg, is exceptionally robust. In simple terms, his legs were built. Years of repetitive strain from walking, climbing, descending, loading, and hauling had caused dense reinforcement in the bones. Biomechanical studies comparing Ötzi's tibia to both modern and ancient populations consistently show that it ranks in the upper percentile for medial-lateral strengthening. In plain language, this is not a man who strolled village lanes. This is a man who climbed slopes, walked ridgelines, crossed valleys, and bore loads through alpine terrain for most of his adult life. His upper body tells the other half of the story. There is almost no indication of occupational stress in the shoulders, arms, or wrists. No major tendon insertions show the hypertrophy you would expect from repetitive tool use like chopping, hammering, or digging. This is not the bone profile of a sedentary farmer, nor a blacksmith, nor a craftsman. It fits neither the static labor of a plowman, nor the repetitive blows of a woodsman. Whatever work he did, it was footwork. A body sculpted by miles, not by tasks done with hands. The most likely reading of this forensic pattern matches what isotope analysis already hinted at in the previous segment. Ötzi was a highland forager, perhaps a herder, perhaps a hunter, perhaps, sometimes both. A man who spent his life moving up and down the vertical world of the Alps, following pasture lines, hunting ibex and deer, foraging, trading, traversing watersheds, and hauling what he needed on his back. But the bones also tell a quieter story, the chronic one. His joints, particularly in the knees and lower spine, show severe degeneration. The cartilage had been worn down to painful levels. The lumbar spine exhibits arthrosis, a kind of osteoarthritis caused by repetitive strain. His right knee in particular reveals osteoarthritic polishing, bone scraping on bone. In a world without ibuprofen or knee replacements, this must have been a source of constant pain. It is likely no coincidence that some of his tattoos, those strange black lines still visible on his leathered skin, are placed precisely over these damaged joints, the lower back, the knees, the ankles, the wrists. These tattoos were not decorative. They were likely medicinal, possibly a form of proto-acupuncture, possibly a pain management ritual, where soot was rubbed into incised skin along pain pathways, perhaps both. Here, as always in archaeology, we can only map the evidence. We cannot hear the whispered explanations. His teeth offer a more mundane but equally human window. Worn, ground down, and riddled with cavities. High carbohydrate diets, typical of Neolithic and Chalcolithic populations reliant on cereal grains, are hard on enamel. And the dental calculus, those rock-hard plaques of ancient Tartar, preserved a time capsule of his microbiome. In that hardened biofilm, scientists have detected remnants of his last meals, traces of pollen, plant fibers, and even the DNA of an oral pathogen associated with gum disease. Ötzi's health profile is, frankly, a mixed bag. He was tough, but not well. A CT scan revealed that he had advanced arteriosclerosis, the hardening of arteries. For decades, this was thought to be a disease of modern life, linked to sedentary habits and saturated fat. Ötzi forces us to revise that assumption. Genetic analysis shows that he carried a hereditary predisposition to arterial plaque buildup. He also suffered from gallstones, whipworm parasite infection, and the earliest known case of Lyme disease. Though to be fair, whether Lyme disease ever became symptomatic for him is impossible to determine. It is a genetic fingerprint, not a diary entry. His nails, or what is left of them, provide one more tiny but telling clue. Bow's lines, horizontal grooves caused by interruptions in nail growth, indicate that he suffered at least 3 episodes of significant physiological stress in the final 6 months of his life. Illness? Injury? Starvation? We cannot say. But the evidence of strain is written there nonetheless. His mitochondrial DNA, inherited from his mother, places him in a now extinct haplogroup, a lineage that once existed in the Alps but has left no direct maternal descendants today. On his paternal line, the Y chromosome shows affiliation with a lineage that is still found in isolated pockets of Sardinia. This again speaks to the genetic isolation of his mountain community, a population bottlenecked and sheltered in the vertical folds of the Alps. And then there is the damage that came after death but before discovery. Scavenger damage around the hips and lower torso suggests that at least part of his body was briefly exposed before the snowfall sealed him under the glacier. Tooth marks suggest small carnivores. Perhaps foxes, perhaps martens. The glacier preserved him, but not before nature tried to reclaim what it could. Every square centimeter of Ötzi's body, from the striations in his worn femur to the soot pressed into his skin, is a line in the autobiography he never meant to write. It is a strange legacy, to become a time traveler not through choice, but through ice, to become a message in a bottle, tossed forward 5,000 years, cracked open by a pair of confused hikers who never imagined they were looking at a man older than the pyramids. And yet, for all this scientific scrutiny, for all our lasers and isotopes and genomes, the full story remains imperfect. We do not know the timbre of his voice. We do not know what language he spoke. We do not know if his knees hurt every day or just on the bad ones. We only know the shadows, the scars, the memories that bodies remember when minds are long gone. And this raises a deeper question. If this is the story a body can tell after 5,000 years, what stories are written in yours? In the next chapter, we descend from the abstractions of bone and blood and step directly into the physical world that Ötzi built around himself. His toolkit, his clothing, his survival systems, the things he chose, or was forced, to carry. Because if the body tells one story, the tools tell another. It is somewhere around 3,300 BCE. In the shadowed valleys of what is now the South Tyrol, a man begins a journey that will end not with a return home, but with a body frozen into memory for over 5,000 years. We know him today as Ötzi, the Iceman. But in these final hours, he was just a living, breathing human, walking, hurting, perhaps glancing back over his shoulder more often than usual, because something had gone wrong, very wrong. And the clues to that story are hidden not in words or legends, but in the pollen stuck to his clothes, the moss particles buried under his fingernails, the wear in his bones, the food in his stomach, and the deep defensive gash that sliced across his hand. This is the part of Ötzi's story that archaeologists now call the last journey, a window of roughly 48 hours before his death. And remarkably, science has pieced together much of what happened, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to whisper a version of events across 5 millennia of silence. His story begins at lower elevation, around 1,200 meters above sea level. There, pollen analysis shows he spent time in a forested subalpine zone where alder and hazel trees grew. We know this because those specific pollen grains, freshly opened from spring catkins, were found in the deepest sections of his digestive tract, which means Ötzi was in the lower valleys sometime in the day before his death, moving, eating, breathing in an environment rich in lowland plant life. But something happened down there, something that left a mark. Across the palm of his right hand is a wound, a deep gash that cuts diagonally through the muscle, a classic defensive injury, the kind of wound you get when you instinctively raise your hand to block a blade. When exactly it happened is still debated. Some estimates suggest 24 to 48 hours before his death. Others propose it could have been as much as a week earlier. What is clear is that it was not fully healed. No scabbing, no major signs of tissue regeneration, fresh, painful, and debilitating. And this is where the chase begins. From that low valley, Ötzi does something odd. He does not return home. He does not settle into a familiar camp. Instead, he begins to climb, rapidly. Within hours, he ascends over 2,000 meters of vertical elevation, from forest to alpine meadow, and then into the barren, wind-blasted rock and snowfields above 3,000 meters. This is not a casual stroll. This is not a hunting trip. The biomechanical strain on his knees, revealed through microfractures and cartilage degeneration, tells us he was a man accustomed to mountain movement. But even for someone like him, this ascent was extreme. Why did he do it? We cannot say with certainty, but the forensic breadcrumbs are telling. In his injured right hand, clutched tightly, were fragments of bog moss, specifically sphagnum moss, a species that does not grow in the alpine zone. It grows in the wetlands of lower valleys, and it is absorbent, antiseptic. Throughout human history, sphagnum has been used as a wound dressing, a primitive but effective bandage, which means Ötzi, after suffering his hand wound, gathered this moss, squeezed out the water, and used it to pack the bleeding gash. He carried it with him as he climbed. Alongside the moss are more accidental passengers, microscopic flecks of birch leaves, fragments of larch needles, pollen from hornbeam and hazel, all plants from the lower elevations. These are not the materials of an alpine journey. They are the residues of someone who fled the forest in a hurry, who did not stop to clean, to prepare, or to change. Then comes the stomach, and the stomach tells its own strange story. When CT scans finally revealed that Ötzi's stomach was not empty, as once believed, but merely displaced upwards during the mummification process, a window opened into his last meal. And it was not a hurried snack. Roughly 4 to 5 hours before his death, Ötzi sat down and consumed one of the highest fat meals ever recorded in the archaeological record. Ibex meat, rich, oily, energy-dense fat from a wild mountain goat. Red deer, possibly organ meat, perhaps liver or spleen. And einkorn wheat, likely in the form of flatbread. There are even traces of bracken fern, a plant that is mildly toxic, suggesting either accidental ingestion or a medicinal attempt to settle his stomach. Why such a feast? Was it a regular meal? Or did he know he needed every possible calorie for the brutal climb ahead? Either way, it suggests something remarkable. In the middle of this crisis, wounded, climbing, possibly being pursued, Ötzi still found time to prepare or share or receive a substantial meal, which raises the unanswerable question, was he alone? The wear on his bones hints at a man used to solitude and labor. But his toolkit, the half-finished bow, the broken arrow shafts, the bundle of unfinished arrows, tells a different story. His primary weapon was unusable. His bow stave was freshly carved from yew, but it was unfinished. No notches for a string, no polish, no bowstring at all. His quiver contained 14 arrows, but only 2 were complete, and both were broken. The others were merely shafts with neither points nor fletching. Why? One theory is that his original bow was lost during the same violent incident that caused his hand wound, or perhaps he broke it himself while fleeing through dense forest. Whatever the reason, it meant that as he climbed into the high Alps, he was functionally disarmed. His only real weapon was his copper axe, a powerful tool, but poorly suited to ranged combat. And yet, the axe was still with him, a precious object. Strange, then, that his eventual killer would leave it behind. But we are not there yet. For now, we follow the ascent. From the pollen record, we know the timeline. He starts low, among alder, hazel, and birch, then ascends rapidly through the conifer zone, where pine and larch pollen are picked up. Then higher still, beyond the tree line, where only alpine grasses and dwarf shrubs survive. His last step into the mountains occurs within 4 to 8 hours after his final meal. He climbs above 3,000 meters, into the gully where the melting glacier would one day reveal him. And here, the forensic trail goes cold. Was he fleeing a specific threat? A band of enemies? A personal feud? A failed negotiation? A theft? Or was it a broader fear? The knowledge that danger could come from any direction in a world with no police, no borders, and no formal justice. There are no signs of a companion, no second set of footprints fossilized in the ice. But then again, Snow erases, wind scatters, and time consumes almost everything. What we do know is this: the injuries to his body, the hand wound, the later arrow wound, combined with the pollen trail, the moss dressing, the food in his stomach, and the unfinished weapons, all suggest a man in flight, or perhaps a man trying to reach something, a pass, a shelter, a friend, or maybe simply distance, the safety of high, empty places. But the Alps, indifferent as always, offered no shelter, only exposure, only exhaustion, only the thin air above 3,000 meters. And as the evening descended, or perhaps the storm clouds rolled in, Ötzi was nearing the end. Though neither he nor his pursuers knew it yet, the final act of this 5,300-year-old story was about to begin. An act written not in words, but in bone, in blood, and in ice. The mystery of who followed him, or whether anyone followed him at all, remains unsolved. But the evidence buried in his body, preserved by the glacier, continues to whisper, a whisper that we, the descendants of the same confused, curious species, are only just beginning to understand. And the next chapter in his story begins with an arrow. If you were walking into the high mountains knowing this might be your final crossing, what would you carry? What tools? What protections? What fragments of home? This is the quiet inventory left behind by a single man whose death, frozen into the glacial silence of the Alps, became an accidental time capsule. A snapshot not just of a life, but of an entire civilization, stitched, napped, tanned, bound, and sharpened into the things he could hold. And while Ötzi the Iceman did not survive the climb, his tools did, his clothes did, his burdens did, and in them we glimpse the logic, the priorities, and maybe even the fears of a man walking toward the edge of his world. Ötzi's body was not alone on that mountainside. When the ice peeled back after more than 5,000 years, it revealed a scattered constellation of objects around him. Not as an orderly burial, but as the debris of someone who collapsed mid-step. His left leg was awkwardly twisted. His pack frame was shattered. Some items were tucked against him, others sprawled several meters away, as if tossed by wind, by gravity, or perhaps by the last fumbling moments of his life. For archaeologists, it was immediately clear. This was not a man caught unprepared. This was a person who carried the distilled knowledge of generations, encoded into wood, fiber, stone, and metal. Let's start with what is perhaps the most famous object Ötzi owned, the copper axe. It is still, to this day, one of the oldest metal tools ever recovered intact in Europe. The handle was crafted from yew wood, roughly 60 centimeters long, with a natural crook that perfectly cradled the blade. That blade was cast from nearly pure copper, 99.7%, shaped into a broad wedge, polished, and then hafted using birch tar resin and tightly wrapped leather. It was not a ceremonial object. The blade showed multiple rounds of resharpening and repair, its edge nicked, sharpened, and nicked again. It had seen work, heavy work, felling trees, butchering, perhaps even combat. And yet, this was no ordinary tool. In an era when metal was still novel and laboriously rare, a copper axe marked you as someone. Whether that meant power, wealth, skill, or danger, well, the debate is still ongoing. But if the axe was a symbol, the bow was the promise of survival. Or at least, it was meant to be. When his body was discovered, Ötzi's bow was there, nearly 2 meters long, rough-hewn but unfinished. It was carved from yew, once again, the best choice in Europe for a bow's strength, flexibility, and snap. And yet the bow was only halfway done. Its surface had not been polished smooth. There were no notches carved for the string, and that raises a question that no one has fully answered. Had he broken his previous bow in a fight? Was this a hurried replacement crafted mid-flight? Or was it simply a work in progress interrupted by his death? We do know one thing. The fact that he hauled this heavy, unwieldy, unfinished weapon up into the highest pass suggests something urgent. A man does not drag a half-made bow into the ice for no reason. Then there was the quiver. More than a dozen arrows were inside, crafted from 2 kinds of wood, wayfaring tree and dogwood, each selected for its straightness, stiffness, and balance. Only 2 of these arrows were finished, tipped with precisely flaked flint heads and fletched with feathers to stabilize their flight. The others were in various states of preparation. Some had nocks cut, Others were little more than straightened shafts waiting for points. Alongside the arrows were antler tines used for pressure flaking the stone tools, a mobile repair kit for his weapons. There was also a long coil of bast fiber, likely intended for a bowstring, or maybe to lash arrowheads. What is clear is that Ötzi was not simply armed. He was in the middle of refitting and replacing his tools as he traveled. This was not leisure. This was necessity, maybe even desperation. Beyond his weapons, Ötzi's toolkit speaks of constant movement, constant readiness. A flint knife with a beautifully knapped blade was sheathed in a bast fiber scabbard, its handle shaped from ash wood. Tiny flakes of flint inside his belt pouch suggest it was regularly resharpened. A rare and puzzling object known as a retoucher, made from lime tree wood with a fire-hardened antler tip, served as his portable tool sharpener, a kind of prehistoric multi-tool that could precisely pressure flake edges back into shape. Birch bark containers, sealed with pitch and filled with charcoal, likely carried embers to restart fires wherever he stopped. A woven grass mat, maybe a cape, maybe a ground cloth, hinted at nights spent under the stars, or in shelters quickly built and quickly left behind. And then there are the stranger items. 2 pieces of birch polypore fungus were threaded onto leather straps. This was not random foraging. Birch polypore contains antibacterial compounds and has long been used as a wound dressing and even as a mild antiparasitic. Another fungus found in his gear, the tinder fungus Fomes fomentarius, was a fire carrier, capable of holding a slow-burning ember for hours. The presence of both suggests a man who understood his environment deeply, or perhaps a man who expected to be wounded. The shoes alone tell an entire story. Their design was ingenious, a base of bearskin with the fur turned inward for warmth, soles of deerskin, and uppers made from a woven net of bast fiber, stuffed with dry grass as insulation. Tests with replicas have shown that these shoes were not primitive. They were high-performance alpine footwear, as effective as modern hiking boots for grip and warmth. The care in their construction, the choice of materials, the repairs made with grass cord suggest a life lived constantly on the move through rugged, cold terrain. And then, the clothing. A loincloth of sheepskin, leggings of goat leather, their alternating dark and light bands perhaps practical, perhaps aesthetic. A jacket pieced together from multiple animal hides, goat, sheep, and perhaps even wild deer. A heavy bearskin cap, stitched with a leather chin strap, rugged enough to keep bitter winds at bay. And above it all, that grass cape or mat, whose function remains ambiguous even today. Each of these items was not just a possession, but a memory, a direct line to the ecosystems he walked through, the animals he hunted or herded, the forests he knew intimately. And yet, the full picture remains incomplete. Some objects are missing. The absence of a finished bow is glaring. Was it lost in a scuffle? Broken earlier in the chase? And more disturbingly, why was none of this taken by his killer? A copper axe, in this time, was worth a fortune. Yet it lay undisturbed beside his body. His arrows, his tools, his clothes, all left behind. Some have argued that this was an act of haste. The killer fled quickly. Others suggest something stranger, that objects associated with death, especially violent death, were seen as tainted, spiritually dangerous. To steal from the dead might invite the same fate. Or perhaps the murderer knew that to take from this man was to carry the burden of his crime forever. When archaeologists first cataloged Ötzi's belongings, the sheer density of knowledge stunned them. This was not just a man walking through the mountains. This was a man carrying thousands of years of inherited skill, wrapped into every fiber, every lash of sinew, every carefully selected branch and hide. His death froze not only his body but his culture in mid-step, giving us a window, brief and fragile, into a world that usually vanishes without a trace. But the objects only raise more questions. Was he fleeing from a rival? Was he crossing enemy territory? Had something gone horribly wrong in a trade, a hunt, or a negotiation? Or was this a journey of no return from the very beginning? And so, the quiet inventory waits. A copper blade dulled by work, a bow left half-finished, arrows waiting for points that will never be napped, and a man walking alone into the ice, carrying everything he knew, but not enough to survive what came next. In the next chapter, we will follow the final hours, through stomach contents, pollen trapped in his gut, and the microscopic traces of his last climb. What was he eating? What was he running from? And what does his body still whisper about the last meal, the last decision, and the last desperate ascent? The scene was set, 3,300 years before the Common Era, a nameless pass high in the Ötztal Alps, roughly 10,500 feet above the world of villages, flocks, and valleys. And there, near the edge of the ice, a single moment crystallized into deep time. A man collapsed face down into the stones. His body fell with force, his lip crushed against a rock, his ribs cracked beneath him, and his blood, briefly warm against the cold mountain air, spilled out fast and terminal. He died alone. Or more precisely, no one was with him when his body finally surrendered. Whether his killer lingered to watch or vanished into the mist remains one of the oldest unsolved mysteries on Earth. It took nearly 5,300 years for someone to notice. When hikers stumbled across the strange, leather-skinned figure melting out of the glacier in 1991, it seemed a tragic but mundane discovery. Perhaps a lost climber, a casualty of the mountain, swallowed by snow and time. But the items told another story. A copper axe, flint blades, grass-woven cloaks, arrow shafts tipped with stone. And soon, the radiocarbon dates whispered something extraordinary. This man had died around 3,300 BCE. He was 5,000 years old, and his death had been captured by the ice. A perfect prehistoric crime scene, preserved beyond imagination. But it would take another decade for the most crucial piece of evidence to surface. In the year 2001, a radiologist reviewing the Iceman's CT scans paused. Something lodged near the left shoulder. A small triangular shape, too perfect to be a bone fragment. On closer inspection, it was clear. An arrowhead, a finely worked stone point, embedded deep inside the tissue beneath the collarbone. How had no one noticed this before? The angle was odd, the depth severe, and suddenly, everything changed. This was not a man who simply froze to death in a storm. This was not an accident. This was a homicide. The arrow entered from behind, slightly above, passing through muscle and into the subclavian artery, a major blood vessel just beneath the left clavicle. Once severed, the bleed would have been catastrophic. Death from this kind of wound, even in a modern trauma center, is likely without immediate surgical intervention. On an alpine slope in the late Stone Age, it was a death sentence. And fast. Estimates suggest the Iceman would have lost consciousness in as little as 2 to 5 minutes. Death within 10 to 15. A brutal end, yet mercifully swift compared to other prehistoric fates. The angle of entry is telling. It was a downward trajectory, from back to front, entering just above the left scapula and plunging forward toward the chest cavity. The direction rules out an accident. This was not a stray arrow falling from the sky. The shooter was positioned higher than the Iceman, either uphill on the slope or standing above him. And the placement suggests intent. Aiming for the upper torso from behind is a calculated kill shot. Not the chaos of a brawl, not the messy improvisation of a fight at close quarters. This was an ambush, or perhaps an execution. But if the arrow was the fatal blow, it was not the only violence Ötzi suffered. His body tells a second story, one more subtle but equally troubling. On his skull, CT imaging revealed a cranial trauma, a blunt force injury to the back of the head, enough to cause brain bruising and swelling. The injury matches a fall. His face was pressed into the stones with enough force to split the lip and damage the nose. Did he fall forward as the blood drained from his body? Or did someone strike him as he collapsed? This is where the evidence becomes murkier. There is no fracture to the skull itself, only internal bleeding. A heavy fall onto a rock could do this, but so could a deliberate blow. A final insurance, a check to confirm the job was done. Another clue, the missing arrow shaft. Whoever fired the killing shot retrieved the wooden shaft from the Iceman's back, leaving only the flint arrowhead buried deep inside. Why? Practicality, perhaps. Arrow shafts are time-consuming to make. Materials like viburnum or dogwood must be cut, seasoned, straightened, and fletched. Or perhaps something darker. Removing the shaft may erase the identity of the killer, in a world where every arrow might be as recognizable as a signature. The choice to leave the valuable copper axe untouched only deepens the mystery. This was not a robbery. The killer ignored one of the most precious items in all of Copper Age Europe. Why? The forensic picture is chillingly detailed for something 5,000 years old. Tiny bone splinters from the shattered scapula tell us the arrow struck with enormous kinetic force. The lithic analysis of the stone point matches regional styles from the southern Alps, suggesting that the attacker was from the same side of the mountain divide as Ötzi himself. This was not a stranger from a distant tribe. It was someone local, someone familiar, and the presence of an older defensive wound, a deep gash slicing across Ötzi's right hand, complicates the story further. That injury occurred days earlier, possibly the result of an earlier fight or a failed encounter, where a blade met skin as Ötzi raised his palm to block it. By reconstructing the timing of his travels through isotopic data, pollen analysis, and the layers of digestion preserved inside his stomach, scientists believe Ötzi was on the run. Roughly 24 to 36 hours before death, he suffered the defensive hand wound, severe enough to disable his dominant hand. He descended from higher ground to a lower alpine valley, perhaps seeking safety, food, or help. Then, for reasons we still cannot fully explain, he climbed again. Upward, into more dangerous terrain, toward the pass where he would die. Was he evading pursuers, trying to cross into another valley, hiding, or perhaps forced to flee after an escalating conflict? What we do know is that his final hours were busy. He ate a heavy meal of ibex fat and red deer, along with einkorn wheat, a feast for high-altitude travel. His unfinished bow, longer than his own height, was still being carved. The arrow quiver contained multiple shafts, but only 2 were properly tipped with stone points. This was not the full kit of a prepared hunter. It was the desperate assembly of someone who had lost their primary weapons, or someone too injured to complete the work. So, was this a murder as we understand it, or something stranger? Some have suggested ritual sacrifice, perhaps an offering to the mountain gods, laid intentionally in the pass, but the evidence does not fit. Ritual burials of this type are not seen in the archaeology of the Alpine Neolithic. No constructed cairn, no offerings, no careful placement. The Iceman died face down, crumpled where he fell. Others have proposed an accidental death, a hunting mishap. Yet the angle, the retrieval of the arrow shaft, and the prior hand wound argue against that. A third possibility is social conflict, a dispute within a community, perhaps a feud, a grievance, a theft, or even a revenge killing. In small prehistoric societies, violence often emerges not from random warfare, but from deeply personal conflicts, resources, honor, betrayal. And in a world without police, courts, or jails, justice is local and lethal. There is also a theory, harder to prove, that Ötzi's death was not a surprise to him. Some suggest the way he packed his gear, the unfinished bow, the collection of tools, the heavy meal, may point to a man who knew he was in danger, a man preparing for a journey that had no guaranteed return. Yet, the final truth, like the mountain that kept him, remains silent. We are left with probabilities, not certainties. A body, a wound, a weapon, but no witness, no confession, no name for the one who pulled the bowstring that day, high in the thin air of the Alps, and sent a small stone point flying into 5,000 years of human memory. And as for Ötzi, his blood is long dry, his bones are long cold, but the story never froze. It simply waited. It is one thing for a human life to end. It is another for that life to linger, perfectly paused, across more than 5,000 years of wind, snow, war, empire, and extinction. Because the truth is, the survival of this single Copper Age body was not fate. It was not destiny. It was a geological accident of such extreme improbability that no one, not even the scientists who studied it, would believe the chain of events had occurred, if they had not been holding the evidence in their own gloved hands. This is the story of how a man became a mummy, not in a tomb, not embalmed by human hands, but by the forces of snow, rock, and ice. A story of entropy delayed, of molecules frozen mid-collapse, and it begins on a high, narrow saddle of mountain stone at 10,500 feet above the modern border of Austria and Italy. By the time of Ötzi's death around 3,300 BCE, the pass where he fell was already a harsh place, not quite the peak, but far beyond the tree line, a place of bare rock, glacial wind, and shifting snowfields. Today it is called the Tiesenjoch, a col between the peaks of Finale-Spitze and Simmelon, but 5,000 years ago it was nameless, an alpine backdoor, one of the few narrow gaps where a determined traveler could cross the central ridge of the Ötztal Alps, or a man being hunted could flee. What matters most is what happened next, because the exact spot where his body fell was a shallow natural hollow, a kind of wind-sheltered trench, cradled by 3 stone ridges. This one physical feature, a basin no more than a few meters wide, was the first piece of luck in a chain of preservation that would hold across 50 centuries. Had Ötzi fallen even 10 meters to the left or right, the story would have ended here. The slow grinding river of glacial ice that edged past his resting place would have scraped his bones to dust within decades. But the trench lay just outside that moving ice flow, and when the snows came, likely within hours of his death, they fell heavy. Thick, wet snow, driven by spring storms or early summer squalls, filled the basin rapidly, and with the snow came insulation. This is the first paradox of ice mummification. Snow, though cold, acts as a barrier. It shields what lies beneath from temperature extremes, ultraviolet radiation, and the constant freeze-thaw cycles that destroy biological tissue. Beneath a dense snowpack, temperatures stabilize just below freezing. Water does not melt, but neither does it sublimate easily into vapor. Instead, it lingers, preserving flesh in a kind of suspended decay. But snow alone is not enough. The next step was compaction. Over months and years, additional snowfall pressed the lower layers into firn, an intermediate stage between snow and glacial ice. Firn is dense, porous, and dry. It wicks away some moisture but also blocks airflow. This gradual transformation trapped Ötzi's body under a thick, insulating shell. What little bacteria remained in his gut and skin slowed to near dormancy. Without oxygen and with temperatures hovering near freezing, decomposition nearly halted. His skin desiccated. His internal organs began to shrink. But crucially, the cycle never went far enough to fully fossilize him into dry bone or mineral. He remained a wet mummy, soft tissue still present, cells still largely intact, hair shafts still holding traces of arsenic, pollen grains, and mitochondrial DNA. For thousands of years, the glacier around the Tiesenjoch expanded and contracted with the rhythms of climate. There were moments of threat. When the glaciers surged during colder centuries, they came dangerously close to overrunning the hollow. But each time the ice flow skirted just wide enough to leave the trench intact. At other times, warmer periods thinned the snowpack, exposing the rocks around the basin to summer melt. But not the basin itself. Its peculiar shape shielded it from both meltwater flows and avalanche debris. It was, quite by chance, a near-perfect microclimate for long-term preservation. This is not typical. Most humans who die in alpine settings vanish quickly into the cycle of erosion. Exposure strips flesh within days. Freeze-thaw fractures bone. Scavengers scatter remains. And when glaciers do claim bodies, they crush them mercilessly, grinding skeletons into bone meal, embedding fragments into the blue ice until, centuries later, a single femur or boot might emerge downstream. This is the fate of most mountaineers who disappear into modern ice fields, but not Ötzi. It was not just the snow and the trench. Other factors aligned. The position of his body, face down, left arm twisted across his chest, meant that his torso shielded many of his tools from exposure. His copper axe lay pressed beneath his body, the haft protected from moisture that might otherwise have rotted it away. His quiver, though damaged, was similarly pinned. Even his grass cloak, an ephemeral object in any other environment, survived, flattened but recognizable. The leathers of his shoes, leggings, and coat became freeze-dried but intact. The grass insulation stuffed into his footwear, a detail that no archaeologist could have guessed from material culture alone, remained visible. And so Ötzi remained in this high, hidden vault of snow and stone. For 5,300 years he lay there. Through the rise of Sumer, the fall of Rome, the plagues and wars and revolutions of all future history, his body shifted only slightly. compressed slowly under snow load, but never destroyed. Until one summer, the spell broke. In the spring and summer of 1991, the European Alps experienced unusually warm weather. Decades of slow glacial retreat accelerated. Ice fields thinned. Snowmelt exposed bare rock at elevations where, for generations, snow had persisted year-round. And on the 19th of September, 1991, two German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon stepped off the marked trail near the Tyssenjoch Pass and noticed something strange protruding from the ice. A dark, shriveled human torso, a spine, part of a pelvis, and fragments of what looked like leather. At first they assumed it was the body of a lost mountaineer, perhaps a victim of a recent storm, or a soldier from the First World War. After all, bodies do occasionally emerge from retreating glaciers. They alerted local authorities. But it soon became clear that this was something else entirely. The tools were wrong. The knife was made of flint. The quiver held arrows of ancient wood. And most shocking of all, the axe was copper, an object that should not have existed in any modern context. When archaeologists arrived, they realized the enormity of what had happened. A Copper Age man, fully clothed, fully equipped, preserved not in a tomb or bog or cave, but in the open alpine wilderness. A discovery so improbable that, had the glacier retreated even slightly faster in prior decades, his body would have been lost to meltwater erosion. Had it retreated slightly slower, it would still be buried today. And yet even now, the preservation is precarious. The act of excavation introduced new risks. As soon as Ötzi was exposed to modern air, the freeze-stable environment that had preserved him collapsed. Moisture began to re-enter tissues. Bacteria, dormant for millennia, reactivated. The body began, however slowly, to decay. Rapid freezing at the research facility in Innsbruck stabilized the process, and later the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology constructed a special chamber designed to mimic the glacier's internal conditions. Inside, Ötzi is kept at -6 degrees Celsius, with humidity carefully maintained at 98% to prevent desiccation without inviting frost damage. He must be periodically sprayed with sterile water to maintain the balance. And still, the damage progresses. The cycle of freeze and thaw during his last months in the open ice created cracks in bone and tissue. Areas of soft tissue around his hips were damaged, possibly scavenged by animals before the first snow sealed him in. His skin, never intended by nature to endure 5 millennia, continues to shrink and degrade. Each new study must be balanced against the cost of exposure. Every biopsy, every DNA sample is a trade-off between knowledge and preservation. But perhaps that is the lesson buried here, that the survival of anything, whether a species, a culture, or a single human life, is always balanced on a knife edge of chance. 1,000 variables align to save Ötzi's body. Another 1,000 continue to erode it. What we have now is a window, fragile, temporary, into a world that would otherwise be erased. A man who should have vanished into stone and snow, but instead remained, waiting, teaching. And as always, this is only what we know so far. For over 5,000 years he lay in silence. No footprints crossed his resting place. No eyes glimpsed his form. Just wind, ice, snow, and the slow breathing of the mountains. Then, one afternoon in the autumn of 1991, by nothing more than coincidence and the chance wandering of two hikers straying slightly off the usual alpine route, a ghost from deep time emerged into the modern world. It was the 19th of September, near the peak of Finale-Spitze, a lonely ridge perched along the shifting border between Austria and Italy. Helmut and Erika Simon, ordinary German tourists, were not searching for history. They were simply descending after a long hike, when Helmut spotted something strange poking out from a patch of melting ice. At first he assumed it was a lost mountaineer, a tragedy surely, but not particularly unusual for this unforgiving alpine landscape where snowstorms can swallow people even in the warmer months. But as they got closer, it became clear. This was no recent casualty. A human torso, brown and leathery, a hip bone still half embedded in ice, and nearby, strange items, a wooden frame, pieces of leather, something that looked like a knife handle. The Simons hurried back to a nearby mountain shelter and reported what they had found. What followed was a recovery process that, in hindsight, teetered between remarkable and nearly catastrophic. The first responders, entirely unaware of the true antiquity of the body, assumed they were retrieving the remains of someone who had died perhaps a few decades earlier. A lost hiker, a mountaineer caught in a storm, maybe even a missing World War I soldier, as Alpine battlefields had indeed yielded frozen soldiers in the past. With that assumption, they did what Alpine rescue crews do. They brought tools suited for digging through hard ice and rock, pickaxes, a jackhammer, even a pneumatic drill. The ice was stubborn. The body was lodged in a gully, pinned by rock on one side and ice floes on the other. Rescue workers hacked away, loosening the torso. A nearby wooden frame was yanked out and initially misidentified as part of a backpack. A copper axe, an object whose importance would only later become clear, was recovered with little ceremony at risk of damage. Over several days, poor weather, including snow and heavy winds, delayed progress. Attempts to arrange a helicopter failed repeatedly. At one point, workers tied a rope around the mummy's arms and tried pulling, causing minor damage to the shoulder joints, injuries that were only recognized later in forensic studies. It was not until the 23rd of September, 4 days after the initial discovery, that the body was finally freed from its icy cradle. Packed into a simple wooden coffin, the mummy was flown by helicopter down to the Institute for Forensic Medicine in Innsbruck, Austria. And that was when everything changed. Within hours, the forensic team realized something was strange. The knife was not steel, but stone, chipped flint, expertly knapped. The axe was not iron, but copper, mounted in a yew wood haft with birch tar adhesive and animal sinew bindings. The shoes were made not of modern synthetic fabric, but deer hide, stuffed with grass for insulation. And the body itself, leathery, desiccated, partially freeze-dried, showed a type of preservation they had never seen in modern alpine fatalities. This was no mountaineer, no soldier, this was ancient, very ancient. Konrad Spindler, an archaeologist from the University of Innsbruck, was among the first to examine the finds. His now famous remark, understated in a way only scientists can deliver, was this: "This is not a contemporary death, this is a man from prehistory." Radiocarbon dating, conducted by multiple independent laboratories, soon confirmed what the artifacts already suggested. The body dated to somewhere between 3300 and 3100 BCE, the middle of the European Copper Age, older than the Great Pyramids of Giza, older than Stonehenge, older than the written word. And just like that, a man who had vanished into the snow 5,000 years ago became the most intact prehistoric human being ever found. His body, his tools, his clothing, preserved not by ritual, not by mummification, but by the sheer physics of snow, ice, and geological luck. Yet even this sudden elevation into global scientific significance did not immediately settle his fate. A different kind of storm was brewing, one made of borders, treaties, and paperwork. Because the icy ridge where he was found straddled the ambiguous boundary between Austria and Italy, drawn after the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1919 along the watershed line between the Inn and Etsch river basins. But that line, as it turns out, had been mapped with a certain degree of, well, generous snow cover. A new survey conducted just weeks after the discovery revealed that the actual find spot was 92 meters, about 300 feet, on the Italian side of the border. And so Ötzi, as the press had now nicknamed him, was transferred to Italy, specifically to the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, where he resides to this day in a specially designed refrigerated vault. The aftermath unfolded like a surreal courtroom drama. The hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, fought for years over a finder's reward. The governments of Austria and Italy negotiated over scientific access. Meanwhile, the media dubbed it the Iceman, and Ötzi became something new. An ambassador from deep time, a face from a forgotten world that now belonged equally to science, to culture, and to the imaginations of millions. But beneath all the spectacle, the news footage, the documentaries, the museum exhibitions, there remained something haunting. Here was not simply an ancient corpse, but a murder victim. A man killed suddenly, violently, and left unburied in the high mountains. A crime scene preserved for 5,000 years. But who was this man really? Why was he there? Why did he die? And what had he carried into that final climb that would freeze his story into the ice? Those questions, like the man himself, were now thawing into the modern world. It is one thing to discover a 5,000-year-old human frozen in a glacier. It is another thing entirely to decide who owns him. In the hours and days following the recovery of Ötzi's body from the ridge near Finalspitze in September of 1991, a peculiar silence settled over the legal status of this ancient man. Because at first, nobody really asked. The assumption was simple, even obvious. The rescue team had been Austrian. The body was brought to Innsbruck, an Austrian city. Therefore, the mummy, whatever it turned out to be, was Austrian, or so it seemed. But borders, like glaciers, are slippery things, especially in the Alps. And as scientists began to realize that this was not just any archaeological discovery, but something extraordinary, the oldest naturally mummified human ever found in Europe, the question of ownership shifted from an afterthought to a geopolitical headache. It was not a new border. The line between Austria and Italy had been drawn back in the year 1919, at the close of the First World War, in the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. It was meant to follow the watershed. Every raindrop falling to the north would eventually flow into the Inn River, and thus toward Austria. Every drop flowing south would eventually find the Etsch, or Adige River, and thus belong to Italy. A simple principle, drawn with the logic of hydrology. Except there was a problem. In the year 1919, the surveyors mapping this alpine border did so under heavy snow. With ice and winter conditions obscuring the true topography, the line was drawn, literally, on ice rather than bedrock. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. After all, this was an isolated ridge. No towns, no farms, no people, only stone, wind, and snow. For the better part of the 20th century, the line sat undisturbed, a technicality on a map. Then Ötzi appeared, and suddenly, a 92-meter discrepancy, barely the length of a football field, became the subject of an international tug-of-war. In October of 1991, less than 2 weeks after the mummy was recovered, a new survey was commissioned. Using modern GPS equipment and snow-free conditions, the results were undeniable. The find spot was on the Italian side, not by much, but enough. Ötzi, it seemed, was Italian. At first, Austria pushed back, understandably so. The body had been recovered by Austrian authorities, housed in an Austrian laboratory, and immediately declared a national treasure. But the Italians, specifically the autonomous province of South Tyrol, filed a formal claim. Their argument was simple. The Treaty of Saint-Germain defined the border by watershed. The mummy lay south of that divide, case closed. For the Austrians, this was a painful twist. Not only were they losing the most significant archaeological find in modern European history, but they were handing it over to a region, South Tyrol, that had been the subject of tense relations since the end of the First World War. South Tyrol had been part of Austria-Hungary before 1919, only to be ceded to Italy, a political wound that lingered for generations among German-speaking Tyroleans. The debate escalated quickly. Newspapers in both countries picked sides. Politicians weighed in. Local authorities issued competing statements. Even as scientists were scrambling to radiocarbon date the body, analyze the artifacts, and prepare the first peer-reviewed studies, bureaucrats were drafting legal briefs, arguing over paperwork, and commissioning lawyers. And amid all of this, a more uncomfortable question began to surface. Who, in fact, has the right to claim the body of a man who lived and died thousands of years before the modern concept of nations even existed? It was not the first time archaeology collided with geopolitics. Museums around the world are filled with artifacts whose ownership remains deeply contested. The Elgin marbles in London, the Rosetta Stone, countless mummies, bones, and treasures removed during colonial expeditions. But Ötzi was different. This was not a pharaoh removed from a tomb by distant foreign explorers. This was a man who had died where he fell. His body had never been removed from his homeland, until now. The debate was no longer just about national pride or museum tourism. It became a mirror reflecting a larger, ongoing global reckoning about how societies handle the remains of the dead. Ethicists weighed in. What did it mean morally to turn a person into an exhibit? Who speaks for the dead when their descendants are unknown, their language extinct, their people long absorbed into the tides of history? Did Austria have a stronger claim because they had recovered the body and initiated the first scientific work? Or did geography reign supreme, meaning that the physical find spot, no matter how small the discrepancy, dictated rightful ownership? For months, the two sides negotiated, sometimes cordially, sometimes with sharp undertones. By early 1992, Austria formally acknowledged the Italian claim, but only under the condition that scientific research already underway in Innsbruck could continue without interruption. Italy agreed. In fact, the province of South Tyrol, which governs the region, rapidly committed funding and resources to build a dedicated facility to house and preserve the mummy. Plans were drawn for a state-of-the-art museum in Bolzano. Refrigeration chambers were designed to simulate the icy, high-altitude conditions in which Ötzi had been preserved for millennia. In hindsight, the transfer was handled with remarkable professionalism, but not without lingering resentment. Some Austrian officials quietly voiced frustration that they had effectively been custodians of a treasure for weeks, only to see it legally reassigned. On the Italian side, there was both celebration and pragmatic concern. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology would suddenly become one of the most visited museums in Europe. The logistics of preservation, security, and long-term scientific access became urgent priorities. And yet, the debate over Ötzi's ownership did not fully end with the border survey. A secondary legal battle emerged, this time not between nations, but between the government of South Tyrol and the very hikers who discovered the body. Under Italian law, finders of valuable cultural heritage are entitled to a reward of up to 25% of the item's assessed value. The Simons, believing this applied to them, filed a claim. South Tyrol initially offered a modest sum, 10 million lira, roughly 5,000 euros, a figure the Simons rejected as insulting. A court case dragged on for years. Tragically, Helmut Simon himself died in 2004 during a hiking accident near the very same mountains where he had once stumbled upon Ötzi. His widow continued the legal fight. It was not until 2008, 17 years after the discovery, that the courts ruled in her favor, awarding 150,000 euros. As for the broader ethical debates, they remain. Should Ötzi be on public display at all? Or should he, as some have argued, be given a proper burial, with his artifacts respectfully interred? Indigenous communities worldwide have increasingly demanded the repatriation and reburial of ancestral remains held in museums. But Ötzi is no one's direct ancestor. His people, his language, his culture, all have vanished, absorbed into the deep history of Europe. For now, science has prevailed. Ötzi remains a subject of continuous study, a frozen window into a forgotten world. But the bureaucratic storm that surrounded his rediscovery is a reminder that archaeology is never just about the past. It is also about the present, the lines we draw on maps, the laws we write, and the stories we choose to tell about who belongs to whom. In the end, the irony is inescapable. A man who once walked a borderless world, a world before nations, before treaties, before legal ownership, now lies preserved behind glass, a citizen of modern bureaucracy, claimed by a place that did not exist when he drew his last breath beneath the Alpine sun 5,000 years ago. It is not every day that a 5,000-year-old murder victim rolls into the Institute of Forensic Medicine, but that is exactly what happened in late September of the year 1991, when the body of a man who had died before the Great Pyramid of Giza was even an idea, was wheeled into a sterile laboratory in Innsbruck, Austria. For the doctors and scientists on hand, it was surreal. This was not just a forensic case. This was something closer to time travel, a patient who had been dead since the late Copper Age, a man who had crossed the Alps long before the Roman Empire, before the Iron Age, before even the Bronze Age existed. And yet, for all the awe, the first steps were purely clinical. Get the body stable. Document its condition. Begin the process of answering what seemed like a simple question. Who was this man, and how did he die? Simple questions, terribly complicated answers. The initial examinations were almost cautious. At first, the assumption was straightforward, even mundane. This was likely the body of a lost mountaineer, perhaps from the late 19th century. The Alps are littered with tragic stories of missing hikers and climbers. The condition of the body, darkened, leathery skin with a mummified but intact frame, was unusual, but not impossible. Cold, ice, and altitude are powerful preservatives. It did not take long, however, for that assumption to collapse. Archaeologist Konrad Spindler was one of the first to take a serious look, and his conclusion stunned the team. This was not a recent body. This was prehistoric. Radiocarbon dating quickly confirmed it. The man in front of them had died between roughly 3,300 and 3,100 BCE, 5,000 years ago. The preservation was extraordinary, but so was the context. This was the oldest intact human body ever found in Europe. The first priority was simple: documentation. Photographs, measurements, visual inspections of every detail. But the real work required looking inside. X-rays were the first tool brought to bear. When the images came back, the team was struck by how well the skeletal structure had survived. Despite 5 millennia in the ice, Ötzi's bones were essentially complete, with only some compression and distortion caused by the movement of the glacier. What stood out immediately were his joints. The hip joints were badly worn, so were the knees and lower back. Degenerative arthritis, the kind of damage that accumulates not over months but over decades of hard physical labor, particularly walking long distances over steep, uneven terrain. His upper body told a different story. The arms and shoulders showed far less strain. This was not a man who spent his life grinding grain or laboring with heavy tools. It matched a pattern more consistent with walking, climbing, perhaps herding or hunting. His body, quite literally, recorded his biography in cartilage and bone. But the biggest questions were not about how he lived. They were about how he died. Forensic scientists quickly noticed an unusual injury on his right hand, a deep cut between the thumb and index finger, a defensive wound, the kind of injury that happens when someone raises a hand to block a blade or strike. But this wound had partially healed. It was at least a couple of days old when he died. A clue, but not yet the answer. The earliest hypothesis was deceptively simple: exposure. Ötzi had been caught in a sudden mountain storm. He froze. End of story. It made sense. The Alps are unforgiving even today. For a Copper Age traveler with no modern gear, a sudden blizzard at 10,000 feet could easily be fatal. The scientists moved forward with that assumption. But then the CT scans arrived, and with them, the mystery deepened. Computed tomography allowed the team to look inside Ötzi's body in 3-dimensional slices. Layer by layer, the internal structures emerged. The lungs were darkened, lined with soot, probably from decades of breathing campfire smoke. His teeth were worn down, cracked, and riddled with cavities. But then, something strange appeared in his chest cavity. A dense triangular object lodged near his left shoulder. Bone had begun to heal around it. Was it a stone, a fragment of bone, a mistake in the imaging? Closer inspection revealed the truth. It was an arrowhead, lodged deep under the collarbone. This was no accident. The arrow had entered from behind, angled upward, severing the subclavian artery. Death would have been rapid, a few minutes, possibly seconds. Ötzi had not died of exposure. He had been murdered. This discovery rewrote everything, but it was not the only surprise. A deep circular wound at the back of his head showed evidence of blunt force trauma. A fall, or something more violent? The timing of this injury relative to the arrow wound became a point of debate that would last for years. Then came the stomach contents. For months, scientists assumed that Ötzi's stomach had decomposed. It had collapsed, looking more like intestines in the scans. It was not until nearly 2 decades later, in the early 2000s, that a team realized they had been looking in the wrong place. The stomach had shifted upward after death, a quirk of decomposition in mummified bodies. When they finally analyzed the correct tissue, the results were astonishing. Ötzi's last meal was still there: ibex meat, fatty, nutrient-rich, red deer, einkorn wheat, and curiously, fragments of bracken fern, likely medicinal, or perhaps accidental. This was no snack. It was a heavy meal consumed only an hour or 2 before death, not the behavior of a man fleeing in desperation. Each piece of analysis opened new questions. Bone density tests revealed he had suffered multiple fractures over his life. Some healed, some more recent. His ribs showed signs of stress consistent with carrying loads uphill. Isotopic analysis of his teeth and bones suggested that while he was born in one valley, he had spent much of his adult life moving between several regions south of the Alpine Divide. He was not simply a local shepherd. He was part of a mobile, interconnected world, a world of trade routes, metallurgy, and alpine travel. The tattoos, too, became part of the forensic puzzle. X-ray and infrared imaging revealed that many of them corresponded directly to joint damage, lines clustered around the lower spine, knees, and ankles. perhaps medicinal, a kind of proto-acupuncture, or a ritual marker of pain and treatment. And then, as the genome was sequenced in the 2000s, more clues emerged. Ötzi carried genetic markers for arteriosclerosis, a hardening of the arteries, long assumed to be a disease of modern sedentary lifestyles. But it turns out genetics play an enormous role. Even a fit, active man in the Copper Age could carry the risk. He also had Lyme disease, the oldest known case in human history. His blood type was O. His eyes were brown, his skin likely darker than modern Central Europeans, and, somewhat anticlimactically, he was balding. Yet for all this data, the early years of Ötzi research were filled with mistakes, misunderstandings, and revisions. The head wound, for example, was long thought to be the cause of death, until the arrow was discovered. The stomach contents were misidentified for over a decade. And for years, the exact sequence of his final hours remained a scientific guessing game, one that would not fully resolve until new pollen analysis, DNA recovery from the arrow shaft, and detailed wound trajectory modeling came years later. If there is a lesson in this first autopsy of deep time, it is not simply that science reveals answers. It is that science is a process, iterative, self-correcting. Each scan, each biopsy, each isotope test pulled a new thread from the tapestry of Ötzi's story, sometimes clarifying, sometimes unraveling what researchers thought they knew. Ötzi was no longer just a curiosity frozen in ice. He was becoming a person again, a man whose body recorded the history of his time in calcium, collagen, carbon, and copper. And yet, despite all this, the greatest question still lingered. Who shot him? Why? Was it a robbery, a feud, a political dispute, or something more mysterious? Those answers lay ahead. But for now, the ice had given up its secrets, at least some of them, and the world was listening. When the Iceman emerged from his frozen grave in the autumn of 1991, his body carried more than bones, more than tools, more than the mystery of a death 5,000 years unsolved. Beneath the leathery brown skin of his back, his legs, his joints, were marks, black marks, lines, crosses, strange, crude tattoos, some obvious, some barely visible to the naked eye. At first, scientists assumed this was cosmetic, decoration. After all, tattooing is ancient, older than writing, older than metallurgy, maybe older than civilization itself. But as the years passed and technology improved, the story written in those tattoos started to whisper something stranger, something more purposeful, something medicinal. Ötzi's tattoos are not colorful flourishes. They are not pictures of animals or symbols of status like we often see in later ancient cultures. They are simple, stark even, mostly groups of short, straight lines arranged in parallel clusters or crosses. When his body was first examined in the early 1990s, scientists manually mapped around 40 tattoos, but that number kept growing. With the arrival of multispectral imaging in 2015, a technology that captures details invisible to the human eye, the number rose to 61 individual tattoos, distributed across 19 different regions of his body. The placements were curious: his ankles, his knees, his lower back, his wrists, his chest, and almost all of them sat directly above joints or muscle groups heavily degenerated by arthritis or biomechanical strain. It was hard not to notice the pattern. The worst inflammation had the most tattoos. Coincidence? Or something closer to therapy? This is where the speculation becomes scientific. Across many cultures, tattoos have been more than art. In some communities in Siberia, Polynesia, and indigenous North America, tattooing was practiced alongside therapeutic treatments, especially for chronic pain. The principle is simple, though the explanation remains a bit mysterious. Small wounds, shallow punctures of the skin laced with carbon pigments, might stimulate the body's immune or neurological response. The ink might not matter. The injury itself might be the point, a prehistoric cousin to acupuncture. In fact, the parallel is striking. Acupuncture as a formal medical system appears in written Chinese records around 2,200 years ago. But Ötzi's tattoos are older, far older, nearly 3,000 years older. This raises one of the strangest but most persistent questions in the Iceman's story. Did some form of pressure point therapy or proto-acupuncture exist independently in Neolithic Europe? Or is this a coincidence of convergent cultural evolution, humanity's long shared experiment with pain relief etched into skin by trial and error? It is impossible to be certain. Science, as always, knows the limits of its confidence. But the alignment is compelling. Take his lower spine. Today we know that Ötzi suffered severe lumbar degeneration. The cartilage in his spine was nearly worn flat. Right over that damaged tissue is a group of parallel lines tattooed vertically along the back. The same is true for his knees, especially the right knee, which shows intense arthritic stress. And indeed, there is a tattoo cluster hugging the back of that joint. His ankles, degraded. His left wrist, damaged. The pattern repeats. Then, in 2015, researchers using multispectral scanning discovered something no one had seen in over 5,000 years. A tattoo completely missed by all prior examinations. 4 short lines on the lower right side of his chest. Why here? The mystery deepens. This is not an obvious joint or weight-bearing location, but it is directly adjacent to 2 of Ötzi's documented internal issues: whipworm infestation in his colon and gallstones lodged within his bile ducts. Whether that tattoo was intended as a treatment, a ritual mark, or a diagnostic symbol is a question that likely died on the glacier with him. And yet the tattoos are only half the story, because Ötzi did not enter the mountains empty-handed. Among the more overlooked items in his kit were 2 small discs of dried fungus, each strung carefully onto leather strips. This was not random. One of these, tinder fungus or Fomes fomentarius, is famous among bushcraft experts even today for its ability to catch and carry embers over long distances. A prehistoric firelighter. But the second species is more telling. Birch polypore, Piptoporus betulinus. This fungus has known antibacterial and antiparasitic properties. It produces compounds that are effective against intestinal parasites, like the whipworms found in Ötzi's gut. Whether he chewed it as a crude antibiotic, brewed it into a tea, or simply carried it as a talisman against illness, we do not know. But it was with him. This medicinal knowledge is no small footnote. It reshapes how we imagine the intelligence and observational prowess of prehistoric humans. To identify that a fungus growing on birch trees has pharmacological properties is no trivial matter. It requires pattern recognition, experimentation, and memory passed between generations, likely oral knowledge preserved for centuries before Ötzi was born. This is, in every sense, science without laboratories. His medical kit was not limited to mushrooms. Chemical analysis of his tools shows residues of birch tar, not just an adhesive, but an antimicrobial substance. His grass cloak and leather garments were designed not only for warmth but to protect against moisture and fungal rot. Every object Ötzi carried, from his copper axe to the unfinished bow, speaks to a life deeply enmeshed in the material intelligence of his landscape. And this may be the most humbling part of his story. We, as modern humans, often imagine the past as a world of ignorance, a dark void awaiting the enlightenment of science. But the Iceman stands as quiet evidence that knowledge does not always require books or microscopes. It can be stitched into clothing, carved into tools, chewed from the bark of trees, or written, quite literally, beneath the skin. It is, of course, fair to be cautious. Science reminds us that our interpretations are built on fragments. The tattoos may indeed have had a symbolic purpose we cannot read. The fungi may have been misidentified as food rather than medicine. There is always the risk of projecting modern narratives onto ancient lives. But what is certain is that Ötzi's body is not a passive fossil. It is an archive, a text written in blood, bone, ink, and fiber, a record of suffering, adaptation, and survival at the raw frontier of human endurance. When the glacier sealed him away around 3,300 BCE, it did not just freeze a man, it froze a mind, a world, a system of knowledge that would otherwise have vanished into the forgetting sands of deep time. His skin still speaks, and though the language is fractured, we are slowly learning how to listen. There is a strange kind of poetry in the fact that a man who never wrote a word has become one of the most thoroughly read individuals in human history. But the language we read him in is not one of ink or sound. It is the molecular alphabet written into every cell of his body. Adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. Strung together in a double helix spiral, 3 billion letters long. And remarkably, 5,000 years after his blood stopped circulating, his genetic code survived, waiting in the cold for someone to figure out how to listen. It was in the year 2012 that a scientific milestone unfolded. Ötzi the Iceman became the oldest human ever to have his entire genome sequenced. For the first time, the script of a prehistoric individual's biology could be read from start to finish. But as is often the case in science, the more precisely we see something, the more complicated it becomes. When scientists at the Urach Research Institute for Mummy Studies and the Max Planck Institute finally mapped Ötzi's genome, the first wave of revelations hit surprisingly close to home. For one, Ötzi had heart disease, or more precisely, advanced arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. This was a twist because modern medicine usually blames clogged arteries on processed food, sedentary lifestyles, and stress. But here was a man who never tasted sugar, never sat in an office chair, and whose life was an unending cardio workout. His arteries were still closing. Why? The answer was genetic. Several inherited risk factors for cardiovascular disease were written into his DNA. This single revelation helped reframe how doctors now think about the balance between genetics and lifestyle in heart disease. Ötzi's genetic health story didn't stop there. His code revealed that he suffered from lactose intolerance, not unusual for Neolithic Europeans. Dairy farming was still relatively new in his world, and the gene that allows most modern Europeans to digest milk into adulthood had not yet spread into his population. If Ötzi drank milk, it would have caused bloating, cramping, and digestive upset. This single gene mutation captures a civilization in transition, halfway between foraging and farming, before the full suite of agricultural adaptations had time to reshape our genome. Another surprise buried in the molecular script was the oldest known genetic evidence of Lyme disease. In Ötzi's DNA, scientists detected fragments of Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacterium carried by ticks that causes the illness. Whether this infection was chronic or incidental is unclear, but it likely contributed to joint pain and fatigue, symptoms that would have burdened him during his long treks through the Alps. His blood type was O. His eye color? Brown, not blue as some reconstructions had once suggested. His skin pigmentation turned out to be darker than anyone expected, an olive to brown tone, not the lighter complexion often assumed for prehistoric Europeans. And here was the most eyebrow-raising revelation of all. Ötzi was likely bald, not shaved, not thin-haired, genetically predisposed to male pattern baldness. It is one of those perfectly humanizing details. In all the deep-time poetry of glaciers and ancient murder mysteries, it is somehow grounding to realize that even 5,000 years ago, someone was losing their hair. And yet, as the genome came into focus, an even larger mystery emerged. Not about Ötzi as an individual, but about the population he came from. Scientists had long believed that by the time of Ötzi, European populations were already thoroughly mixed between the early Anatolian farming migrants and the indigenous Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. But Ötzi's genome did not follow that pattern. Instead, it was dominated, nearly overwhelmed, by early farmer ancestry, with hardly any trace of the hunter-gatherer line. This was startling. It suggested that Ötzi's community in the High Alps was unusually isolated. A comparison of his genome to thousands of modern Europeans revealed something even stranger. Ötzi's closest living relatives are not in Austria, Italy, or Switzerland. They are in Sardinia. The reason is not that Ötzi was Sardinian, but rather that Sardinians have retained more of that early Neolithic farmer DNA than any mainland population. In other words, the same wave of agricultural settlers who migrated into Europe 7,000 years ago left their deepest genetic footprint not on the continent itself, but on an island isolated from the genetic mixing that followed. Ötzi and modern Sardinians are echoes of the same chapter in human migration, a chapter otherwise overwritten in most of Europe. This realization reshaped how scientists think about the peopling of Europe. It highlighted how geography, mountain valleys, islands, coastlines, can act as genetic time capsules, preserving lineages long after they disappear elsewhere. It also exposed a flaw in earlier models of European ancestry that had underestimated just how heterogeneous prehistoric populations were. The idea of clean, smooth migrations gave way to something more tangled, a web of micropopulations, some highly mixed, others stubbornly isolated. Of course, no study is without its limitations. The genome was from one man, a snapshot, and as every geneticist will caution, a snapshot is not a full movie. Was Ötzi typical of his community, or an outlier? Later studies of ancient genomes from the southern Alps started to suggest that he was not entirely alone. Other bodies from the region showed similarly high Anatolian farmer ancestry. But whether this pattern held for the whole region remains a topic of ongoing research. What is humbling about this entire genomic voyage is how it continues to remind us that answers are always provisional. DNA gives us probabilities, patterns, predispositions, not certainties. Ötzi's genome tells us that he was predisposed to heart disease, but it does not tell us whether his arteries would have eventually killed him had an arrow not intervened. His lactose intolerance tells us what his body struggled to digest, but not what he preferred to eat. His baldness gene makes a strong case for his hairline, but the mummification process complicates any absolute conclusion. The genome is a whisper, clear enough to guide us, but quiet enough to force us to listen carefully, cautiously, and humbly. In the end, the genetic legacy of Ötzi is not just a list of traits. It is a reminder that the story of Homo sapiens is written on multiple layers. One layer in flesh, another in bone, another in artifacts, and yet another in the chemical script wound around the spools of our cells. And just as glaciers can preserve a body against the odds of time, so too can DNA preserve the story of how our ancestors lived, suffered, adapted, and carried their biology across the Ice Age and into the Copper Age. And here Ötzi remains, not just a body frozen in time, but a code still unfolding. It turns out that even 5,000 years ago, identity was more complicated than we like to imagine. For a long time, scientists assumed that Ötzi, like most Neolithic Europeans, would be a mixture, part descendant of Europe's indigenous hunter-gatherers, part descendant of the farming communities that swept in from the Near East after the end of the Ice Age. It was a tidy model, and tidy models are always tempting. But Ötzi, as usual, had other plans. When his genome was first sequenced in the year 2012, the results were already provocative. But it was the improved high-coverage sequencing in the year 2023 that truly shattered expectations. The data was now clear enough to answer a question that had lingered for decades, not just who Ötzi was as an individual, but where his people had come from, and how they fit into the broader genetic story of Europe. The answer? Ötzi's people were not the mixed descendants of foragers and farmers. They were farmers, almost entirely. His genome showed an unusually high percentage of ancestry tied to early Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, the same migrants who had started moving into Europe nearly 8,000 years earlier, bringing with them agriculture, animal domestication, and a radically different way of life. To understand how strange this is, we have to step back into the broader timeline. After the glaciers of the last ice age receded, Europe was repopulated by bands of hunter-gatherers, the descendants of upper Paleolithic societies who had endured the long cold. These were resilient, mobile people who lived by foraging, hunting, and fishing. Then, sometime around 10,000 years ago, a seismic cultural shift began. From the fertile plains of Anatolia and the Levant, the first agricultural societies began expanding, first into the Balkans, then steadily westward across Europe. By around 7,000 years ago, these farming communities had reached Central Europe, and for a time they lived alongside the older foraging populations. There was interbreeding, there was trade, sometimes there was conflict. By the Copper Age, the time of Ötzi, the assumption had been that these populations were fully blended. Genetic studies from Germany, France, Hungary, and Scandinavia had consistently shown a cocktail of ancestries, roughly half Neolithic farmer, half Mesolithic hunter-gatherer. And yet Ötzi defied that pattern. His DNA revealed almost no detectable contribution from local hunter-gatherers. Instead, his genome matched closely with that of early Anatolian farmers, far more than any contemporary mainland population. This was not just unusual, it was unprecedented. No other known Neolithic individual from mainland Europe carried so little hunter-gatherer ancestry. Even stranger was the modern connection. When geneticists compared Ötzi's genome to present-day populations, his closest living relatives were not in the Alps, nor anywhere on the mainland. They were on the islands of Sardinia and Corsica. This does not mean that Ötzi was Sardinian. It means that Sardinians have retained a higher proportion of early Neolithic farmer ancestry than almost any other population in Europe. The reason is simple: isolation. While mainland Europe experienced wave after wave of migration, including the dramatic influx of steppe herders during the Bronze Age, Sardinia remained relatively untouched, preserving a genetic snapshot of the first farmers. This single result forced archaeologists and geneticists to reconsider long-standing models of European prehistory. If Ötzi's community in the Alps retained such a pure strand of Neolithic ancestry, it suggested that parts of the Alpine region had been far more isolated than previously believed. The mountains had acted as a genetic refugium, a place where the descendants of early farmers could persist for thousands of years without being significantly reshaped by incoming populations. It also raised a new question. Was Ötzi an outlier, or was his entire community similarly isolated? Follow-up studies began sequencing other ancient remains from the region. Some showed similar patterns of high Anatolian farmer ancestry, suggesting that Ötzi was not unique but part of a broader Alpine population that had remained genetically conservative well into the Copper Age. There is another layer to this story. Earlier models had placed significant emphasis on the arrival of steppe ancestry into Europe during the Bronze Age, ancestry linked to the Yamnaya herders from the Pontic Caspian steppe. This genetic influx had been associated with the spread of Indo-European languages and massive cultural transformations across Europe between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago. But Ötzi's genome contained no trace of steppe ancestry whatsoever. His death preceded that migration. He belonged to a world that was about to vanish. The last chapter of the Neolithic before the great upheavals of the Bronze Age rewired the genetic landscape of the continent. And yet, even as his genome told a story of isolation, it also hinted at connection. His copper axe, made from ore sourced in southern Tuscany, showed that trade networks stretched far beyond his mountain home. His unfinished bow, his arrows, his leather toolkit, these were the products of a sophisticated material culture, plugged into wider economic and social systems. He may have lived in an isolated gene pool, but he was not culturally isolated. The DNA in his blood and bones carried one story. The artifacts in his hands carried another. As for descendants, well, the answer is complicated. In 2013, a study comparing Ötzi's Y chromosome haplogroup to modern populations found that 19 men in the Tyrol region shared the same paternal lineage. This does not mean they are direct descendants in the simple sense, 5,000 years is a very long time, but it does mean that some of the genetic lines he carried continued through the millennia, passed from father to son. But perhaps the more profound legacy is not genetic, but informational. Ötzi's DNA became a turning point for the field of paleogenomics. It proved that viable ancient genomes could be recovered even from wet mummies, not just from bones or teeth. It validated new methods of DNA extraction, sequencing, and contamination control, and it sparked a wave of similar studies, from Egyptian mummies to Andean ice children to medieval skeletons buried under London. His genome also reframed public conversations about ancestry, identity, and migration. It reminded us, sometimes uncomfortably, that the past is never as neat as we imagine. The idea of pure populations, of stable ethnic identities stretching unchanged through time, simply does not survive contact with the data. Europe has always been a palimpsest, layer upon layer of migration, replacement, blending, isolation, and renewal. Ötzi's people were farmers from Anatolia. Before that, their ancestors were foragers in the Levant. And before that, they were just another band of Homo sapiens pushing out of Africa into the unknown. If there is one thing the Iceman teaches us, it is that history, like the glacier that once buried him, is always moving, slowly, relentlessly, changing everything in its path. When you stand in front of Ötzi today, or rather in front of the replica of Ötzi, there is a strange, almost unsettling sensation. This is not a statue. It is not a guess. It is a human being whose skin has been dragged back through 5,000 years of time, molecule by molecule, fold by fold. But how do we do that? How do we take fragments of bone, shrunken leathery skin, a flattened hip, and a misshapen face, and reconstruct a living body with accuracy? This is the quiet art of scientific resurrection. It begins, as most things now do, with data. In the years following Ötzi's discovery, high-resolution CT scans were performed, thousands upon thousands of slices through his body, capturing not just the bones but the tissues, the scars, the collapse of muscle and sinew, and even the distortions left by death itself. These scans are the digital blueprint of a human frozen in time. But a blueprint is not a body. Translating those scans into something tangible required one of the largest stereolithographic 3D printers in the world, a machine called the Mammoth. The Mammoth works by layering thin films of liquid polymer, one atop another, hardening each layer with ultraviolet lasers. Over several days, the empty space slowly fills: ribs, spine, shoulder, fingers, skull. It is an eerie process, watching a body rise from a vat of resin, not unlike how the glacier once entombed the real Ötzi in layers of ice. The CT data alone produced a physically accurate skeleton and muscle form, accurate to the millimeter. But no 3D printer can capture the fine details of texture, decay, and the scars of time. That part is still stubbornly, beautifully analog. It requires hands. Sculptors like Gary Staub spent weeks applying layers of soft clay over the printed skeleton, working from both the digital scans and direct visual studies of the mummy itself. And this is where things get strange, because Ötzi's body is not simply intact, it is distorted. After 5,000 years under the weight of shifting ice, his face is asymmetrical, his nose is flattened, his lips are pressed sideways from lying face down on rock, his hip is shattered, likely scavenged by animals shortly after death. His lower back is compressed. These are not minor details. They are the final punctuation marks on a life story that did not end cleanly. The sculptor is faced with a dilemma that every paleo artist understands intimately. Do you correct the distortions to show what Ötzi looked like in life? Or do you reproduce the damage to reflect the reality of his discovery? For this project, the answer was both. The goal was to create the most accurate visual record of the body as it was found, while also annotating every distortion, every missing tendon, every collapsed joint, so that the viewers understand what is time and what is man. A particularly challenging feature was the skin. Mummified skin is not like living skin. It shrinks, it toughens. The outer layer, the epidermis, is often completely lost. What remains is the dermis, fibrous and leathery, full of cracks, folds, and voids. To replicate it, Gary's team used a combination of fine clay sculpting and texture stamping, pressing silicone molds, patterned from samples of animal skin, into the soft clay. Thousands of individual impressions were made: creases of the neck, folds around the ankles, the shattered tissue of the hip. And then, the tattoos. Ötzi has 61 known tattoos, the oldest preserved tattoos on any human body ever discovered. But these are not decorative. They are simple lines, crosses, and dots, many clustered around joints afflicted by arthritis or degeneration. Some researchers argue they were therapeutic, a primitive form of acupuncture. Others suggest a ritual significance. Either way, they had to be mapped meticulously onto the replica. Modern multispectral imaging revealed tattoos invisible to the naked eye, faded marks beneath the surface. Each was inked carefully onto the model using carbon-based pigments mixed into the silicone skin, matching not just location but the subtle fading and cracking of the original. Then came the color. Painting a mummy is not like painting a statue, it is layering. Hundreds of transparent washes of pigment to recreate the translucent, mottled, almost waxy quality of preserved flesh. The process started light, adding a base tone that matched the yellow-brown leather of mummified skin. Then darker tones, to replicate the shadows within every pore and wrinkle. Then the smallest details, fingernail beds, hair follicles, the bruising where blood pooled before death. And the hair, or rather, the lack of it. Ötzi's genome revealed something that surprised everyone. He was likely bald, or nearly so. Earlier reconstructions had given him shoulder-length hair, based on cultural assumptions and a few preserved hair fragments. But the genetics did not lie. The male pattern baldness variant was present. The replica would need to reflect that uncomfortable, very human reality. Beyond the face and flesh, there was also the matter of the objects. Every tool, every garment, every stitched seam had to be reproduced. His coat, a patchwork of goat and sheep hides, worn soft from years of use. His leggings, goat leather, stitched with sinew. His shoes, deer hide, with an inner layer of woven grass for insulation. Even the copper axe had to be remade, the blade cast from nearly pure copper, mounted in a yew wood shaft with birch tar glue, exactly as it was 5,000 years ago. The final replica, life-size, full-color, anatomically exact, is almost unbearable to look at, because it does not feel like looking at a reconstruction. It feels like standing next to him. Not Ötzi the mummy, not Ötzi the artifact, but Ötzi the man. The question remains, what is the purpose of this act? Is it science? Is it art? Is it an ethical gray zone? The recreation of a person who cannot consent, whose life ended in violence, whose body was hidden by ice for millennia precisely because he was trying not to be found? The scientists involved are humble about this tension. The replica is not a resurrection. It is not even truly a portrait. It is, in the end, a data visualization, a way for the public, and for future scientists, to engage with something that otherwise exists only behind glass, in a sterile, temperature-controlled vault in Bolzano. It is a reminder that this man was not a myth, not a legend, not a ghost. He was real. He walked. He breathed. He fought. He ate. And in the final moments, as blood seeped from his artery into the snow, he became a story that would not be finished for 5,000 years. And perhaps is still not finished yet. There are moments in the history of science where the accidental becomes revolutionary, where something never intended to be preserved, never meant to be remembered, becomes a mirror that forces an entire field to rethink everything it thought it knew. Ötzi the Iceman is precisely that kind of moment, because for all the extraordinary finds that archaeology has delivered, tombs, pyramids, cave paintings, buried cities, nothing quite compares to a single human, fully intact, frozen in time with his clothing, his tools, his stomach full, and his genome whispering secrets from 5,000 years ago. Before Ötzi's discovery in the autumn of 1991, paleoanthropology was a discipline shaped primarily by bones, skeletons, teeth, stone tools. It was a science of fragments, of partial stories assembled from whatever the earth was willing to give back. Organic materials like leather, wood, fiber, or even flesh almost never survived. The story of prehistoric humans was written overwhelmingly in stone, but then a glacier on the border of Austria and Italy peeled back a corner of its ancient memory, and the story suddenly grew skin, muscle, blood, and breath. Ötzi's impact on archaeology and anthropology cannot be overstated. He became the most studied human body in the history of science, and not just because he was old, but because of what he offered: a snapshot of a moment, a forensic time capsule, a convergence of biology, culture, climate, technology, and death, all sealed together in one accidental grave of ice. The first wave of research focused on the forensic, the body itself. CT scans, X-rays, and tissue biopsies unlocked something astonishing. Prehistoric humans were not mysterious shadows of ourselves. They were us. Ötzi carried arthritis in his joints. He had cavities in his teeth. He had gallstones. He suffered from Lyme disease. His arteries were narrowing with heart disease. In his genetic code, researchers even found the same risk factors for diabetes and obesity that plague the modern world. This was not some alien ancestor. This was humanity, as vulnerable then as now. But the revelations extended beyond biology. Ötzi fundamentally changed how scientists understood prehistoric medicine. The discovery of birch polypore fungus, an antibacterial and antiparasitic mushroom, threaded onto a leather strap, was the first hard evidence that Neolithic humans practiced medicinal self-care with botanical knowledge. Combined with the 61 tattoos clustered near joints worn down by strain, it forced researchers to re-examine assumptions about the origins of acupuncture and therapeutic tattooing. What was once considered a tradition with roots in ancient China might, in fact, stretch back far deeper, to the mountains of Copper Age Europe. The tools found alongside Ötzi rewrote entire chapters in technological archaeology. His copper axe, for example, predates the widespread adoption of metal tools in that part of Europe by centuries. Its blade was nearly pure copper, cast from ore sourced hundreds of miles away in what is now southern Tuscany. This discovery revealed not just metallurgy, but long-distance trade networks stretching across the Alps. His unfinished yew longbow, his finely crafted arrows, his flint-tipped dagger, and even his fire-starting kit were direct physical testimonies to a complex society balancing on the cusp between stone and metal. Ötzi also transformed the emerging science of archaeogenetics. When researchers sequenced his genome in 2012, one of the first ancient human genomes ever fully decoded, it cracked open an entirely new way to study the past. No longer were scientists limited to bones and artifacts. Now they could reconstruct ancestry, population migration, genetic diseases, even physical appearance. Ötzi was the first ancient European whose blood type was known, the first whose eye color was confirmed, the first whose genetic heritage could be traced, revealing that his closest modern relatives are not the Austrians or Italians near where he was found, but the people of Sardinia, whose genetic lineages remained remarkably stable over millennia. And the surprises did not stop there. Microbiome analysis, studying the DNA of bacteria found in his gut, showed that Ötzi carried strains of Helicobacter pylori, the same stomach bacteria linked to ulcers today. Except his strain was ancestral, a genetic mix of Asian and African variants that no longer exists in modern Europe. This data became crucial in mapping how human diseases spread alongside migrations, a biological thread connecting continents and cultures far older than written history. Climate archaeology, an emerging field in the early 2000s, also benefited enormously from Ötzi's icy tomb. By analyzing the pollen trapped in his stomach, scientists reconstructed his final movements in the days before his death. They matched this data to changing tree lines and snow cover in the Alps, providing one of the most detailed environmental reconstructions ever performed for the Copper Age. It allowed researchers to witness, in stunning resolution, how climate change, seasonal shifts, and resource availability shaped the lives and deaths of prehistoric humans. Perhaps one of the most unexpected contributions Ötzi made was to the science of forensic anthropology itself. The techniques developed to study his body, especially in non-destructive imaging, became the foundation for modern forensic practices used in crime labs around the world. How to reconstruct soft tissue injuries from CT scans, how to model trauma in ancient bone, how to preserve fragile organic specimens without introducing contamination. Techniques first refined on a 5,000-year-old murder victim now help solve 21st century crimes. Ötzi also forced a reckoning in museum ethics and the study of human remains. Who owns the past? When the Austrian and Italian governments fought a legal battle over his remains, it raised international debates about the rights of indigenous peoples, the ethics of displaying human bodies, and the line between scientific study and cultural respect. His presence in the South Tyrol Museum remains one of the most visited and most debated exhibitions in Europe. Even in the public imagination, Ötzi shifted something profound. He made prehistory personal. No longer was the Neolithic a vague, faceless era of stone circles and broken bones. Suddenly, it had a face. A man with back pain, a man who stitched his shoes, who ate wild ibex and einkorn wheat, who bled into the snow beneath an arrow shaft, and who, by sheer chance, was held in ice long enough to become immortal. And the scientific impact continues to ripple outward. Every few years, a new technology, a finer DNA sequencer, a more powerful imaging technique, a better isotopic analysis, returns to Ötzi's body and extracts something new. The work is never finished, because the body is not simply a body, it is a data archive, a library of forgotten knowledge. In the end, Ötzi is not just a window into one man's life. He is a mirror reflecting how fragile, how interconnected, and how persistent humanity really is. His bones, his blood, his microbiome, and his skin are not just relics of a distant past. They are reminders that the boundary between then and now is paper thin. One slip on a glacier, one storm, one arrow, and 5,000 years later, a man frozen in time rewrites the story of everyone who came before and everyone who comes after. They say murder has no statute of limitations. But what about 5,000 years? What Ötzi left behind is not just a corpse or even a crime scene. It is a mirror, one that keeps reflecting back whatever generation is looking. From the moment his body was discovered in the melting ice of the Alps in 1991, This one man's frozen death has become a vessel, filled, emptied, and refilled with the assumptions, projections, and obsessions of every scientific era. At first, he was thought to be a missing mountaineer, then a sacrificial figure, later, a tribal elder, a coppersmith, a shepherd, a victim, a warrior, a fugitive. In truth, he might have been none of these things, or all of them. But what we do know, with unsettling clarity, is this: his death was violent, and his story did not end with it. Let's recap clinically. The body shows a deep defensive wound to the right hand, slicing down through the thumb, consistent with fending off a blade. An arrowhead of flint was found lodged in the left shoulder, its trajectory severing the subclavian artery. Death would have followed in mere minutes, likely from blood loss. Trauma to the skull suggests either a fall or a final blow. But when, and by whom? Theories have swirled. Ambush? Revenge? Exile? Was it personal or political or opportunistic? The lack of valuables taken, including his prized copper axe, suggests it was not simple robbery. The setting, high in a mountain pass, may hint at flight, or perhaps at ritual. But despite decades of investigation, no consensus has emerged. That may say more about us than about him. Science has resolved many technical details: CT scans, isotopic tracing, radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA. They've illuminated his diet, his health, his ancestry, even his last meal. But motive? That still eludes us. Because motive lives in the mind, and Ötzi's mind is gone. What survives is just enough evidence to endlessly interpret, to reframe, to narrate. And we keep doing it, because deep down, we're not just trying to solve his story, we're trying to see ourselves in it. The farmer versus hunter theory? That's a modern anxiety about the origins of inequality. The idea of Ötzi as a healer with tattoos for pain relief? That's our wish to see ancient people as wise and holistic. The lonely man climbing into the snow, perhaps exiled from his tribe? That's the myth of the solitary hero. Even the term Iceman, with its cinematic flair, is a modern label for a person who probably never called himself anything close to that. In a way, every layer of science applied to Ötzi has peeled back another layer of narrative, but never the core. That remains cold, ambiguous, unresolved. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say is this: Ötzi died violently in the Alps around the year 3300 BCE. His body froze by chance. His death, by contrast, was not chance. It was human. It involved a choice. And for 5,000 years, we have been trying to understand what kind of world makes a person kill, and what kind of world remembers it. So maybe this is why he haunts us, because we are still living with the same patterns: scarcity, violence, competition, fear, but also memory, curiosity, the need to know who we are by knowing who came before. Ötzi has become more than evidence. He has become narrative material, and in that transformation, he has achieved something no one from his world could have imagined: immortality, the kind that cannot be preserved in flesh, only in questions. When Ötzi died on that high mountain pass, he had no idea that the snow around him was about to become time itself, that it would encase his body, hold its shape, protect it from the air, and press pause on the usual decay of memory. He didn't set out to become a symbol, or a data set, or a museum centerpiece, but the universe, in one rare convergence of climate, geography, and luck, decided to keep him. That raises an unsettling question. How are we remembered? Most of us won't be. The archaeological record is, by definition, a filter. It forgets almost everything. Soft tissue, daily moments, laughter, intention, all gone. Even the hard stuff like tools and bones are rare survivors. And even rarer is context. For every Ötzi, there are millions who vanished completely. This should humble us, not depress us, but ground us, because we are not remembered by default. We are remembered by accident, by ice, by fire, by story. What Ötzi teaches us is not just about ancient medicine or metallurgy or social networks. It's about impermanence. His tattoos fade, his genome degrades. The glacier that held him is now retreating. Even this miracle of preservation is temporary. But while the ice lasts, we can listen, and we can learn. And maybe, just maybe, We can take his survival as a reminder that every human life, even the most obscure, is worth decoding. And so we end, not with an answer, but a paradox. Ötzi is at once completely unique and completely ordinary. He is one man in one moment preserved forever, but he is also all of us, mortal, fragile, trying to survive with the tools and knowledge of our time. The difference is that the mountain decided to keep him. So the next time you walk outside and feel the air against your skin, know this: it is erasing you. But if you're lucky, or unlucky, or chosen by climate and fate, you might leave behind something. A bone, a word, a trace. And if someone finds it and asks who you were and wonders what you meant, you'll be part of deep time too. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this glacier of time with me, for tracing the footsteps of a man who never meant to be remembered, and yet was, for slowing down, for drifting into deep time, and for remembering that even the most fragile life can echo across 5,000 years if the ice decides to keep the memory. If this story helped you fall asleep, helped you focus, or just helped you step outside the noise for a little while, thank you for being here. If you believe more sapiens should know that history runs deeper than textbooks ever tell, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share this story with the curious minds in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while driving, studying, or somewhere out there in the world, a place I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.